We did receive men back that had to have treatment, certainly, both physically and mentally, but not that extreme. In all probability, Senator, those individuals, if kept and treated, were not released because the Vietnamese and the Laos did not want to expose to the world their very primitive medical capabilities.
Or they might have died.
Or they might have died, but there have been reports since then that there is a group that is held south of Hanoi who are, quote, American war wounded and mentally impaired.
What source is that, Colonel?
That is an intelligence report. I don't remember what agency it came from offhand. I'd have to check it out.
Was that dated, do you know? Or can you supply us any
about
details on that?
1978.
I'd like to see that myself, if you can supply us any information to identify it. I know your son is one of the missing. Have you received information from other than government sources as to his present status or whereabouts? Can you share that with us?
As I mentioned, he was carried as missing in action by the Air Force, and then he was declared dead in July of '82. Following my return from Vietnam and Laos as a member of the League delegation that went over there, we had a letter from the Department of Justice wherein a three-man commission had reviewed his case and told us that, based upon information provided to them by the Air Force and other agencies, that they determined that Earl was actually captured and was a prisoner of war. I've received some information privately, which I cannot document, and I cannot I cannot say it is absolutely true, but I believe it, that a team was inserted into the area where Earl was evading. They did find his radio, but they did not find Earl.
Along that line, your son was flying the second seat, I think, in a F-4 plane, and Captain Keith Hall was the other pilot.
Yes, sir.
Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
What indications did, or rather, I understand you have talked to Captain Hall.
Yes, sir.
And that he is related to you certain information regarding your son. Can you share that with us as to what Captain Hall knows about your son being captured and when he last saw him and what condition he was in?
The last time Captain Hall knew of Earl was in the aircraft itself, because Captain Hall ejected first. Earl stayed with the aircraft because he was having trouble with his ejection system. Earl's beeper was picked up by other aircraft on the ground. The other aircraft established voice contact with Captain Hall. Captain Hall did not have any knowledge of what happened to Earl after Captain Hall was ejected from the aircraft. However, 2.5 years later, for some reason unknown even to Captain Hall, he was called out of his cell and was submitted to interrogation by a Vietnamese interrogator, and the entire session dealt with Earl. More information of a personal nature. Was he married? Did he have any children? Where did he live? Where did he go to school? What was his education? What about his parents, etc.? But it was strange to us that if Earl was dead, why would the Vietnamese have an interest in him 2.5 years after his incident? And Captain Hall then asked the interrogator if Lieutenant Hopper was in the prison camp. And according to Captain Hall, the interrogator merely shrugged his shoulders and walked out.
Have you received full disclosure from government agencies on the status of your son and the details of his attempt to elude capture? Can you provide the information?
As I mentioned, Senator, the official information that I've received on Earl goes up through the fact that his beeper, his emergency radio beeper, was picked up for 3 consecutive days after his shoot down. The other information that goes beyond that is from a private source that I cannot verify, I cannot document. I feel, however, that there is information on Earl because when we were at Randolph Air Force Base for the status of review hearing, there were some classified documents introduced into that hearing which was made available to the 3 board Air Force officers.
When was that hearing?
That was in 1980, I believe. February of 80, if I recall correctly, because then they declared him dead in 82. And we objected to this, and it's a matter of our status review hearing that we objected to classified information being introduced into that hearing which was not available to me or my wife or to my civilian attorney.
You've never seen that?
No, sir.
I'm going to ask the chairman if we can run that information down for our executive session. Just one more or 2 questions, Mr. Chairman. I know time's running out. Colonel, you've done so much in this area. What reason, which mystifies me, the Vietnamese want to be holding Americans today? Wouldn't they really prefer to let them die or kill them and return their remains? Isn't it high risk, high cost for them or the Laotians to continue to hold Americans? What do you think would be the motivation for that decision?
Senator, if we only knew what went on inside of the minds of a communist Oriental, we'd probably have that answer, but we don't know. But certainly, if you went back into history, you would find historically that communist governments keep the enemy POWs behind. Russians did it to the Germans after World War II for 16 to 18 years. Vietnamese did it to the French for up to 22 years. The North Koreans and the Chinese did it to Americans for 2 years and longer after the Korean War is over. I think there may have been something worked out between Kissinger and Lee Duc-Tho that for some reason Lee Duc-Tho held prisoners back as bargaining points, not trusting Kissinger to continue with his pledge of $3.25 billion in reconstruction aid. And probably then Kissinger turned his back on these people and did not go back to the bargaining table. Therefore, he was caught with these American prisoners. I believe they hold them to their own advantage to impress their own people with the fact that they kicked Uncle Sam out of Southeast Asia and they're still rubbing our nose in the dirt. I think also, however, they're using them for their own special purposes, possibly maintenance of American equipment and other things. There could be a series of reasons and not any one.
Do you think we should offer ransom for any of those as an official policy?
Senator, I'm in favor of taking any action necessary, whether it's ransom or a military operation, to bring our American prisoners home.
Colonel Hopper, do you believe that there is a concerted effort, or has been a concerted effort, by our government officials, DIA or any place else, not to proceed and follow all leads, and in fact may have participated in some form of covering up this subject matter and information that ought to be
I don't want to
disclosed?
use the term cover-up, Senator, but I definitely feel there's been a suppression of information at the various levels when you recognize the intelligence system is so compartmented that one individual is working in one area, maybe not be speaking to another individual working in another area. He will make a personal judgment on a piece of information as not being any good without providing it to the people who could have some use for it. I think it's in the system. And yes, I have my personal opinion that there has been information reported that has not been followed up, because how can you keep refugee reports open for 6, 8, and 10 years and not be able to either to prove them or to discount them? And that's the case of those 95 live sighting reports. Nearly half of those are 8, 10 years old or older. Something is wrong when we cannot take reports and verify the validity of them or discount them.
Chairman, I have other questions. I'll submit them because of time. I want to thank Colonel Hopper for his participation here today.
Thank you very much, Senator DeConcini, and thank you, Senator Cranston, for filling in my absence. Representative McKeon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would echo the comments of Senator Cranston and Senator DeConcini and my appreciation for your testimony and commitment to Colonel Hopper Jr. and just express my disappointment that a colonel in the service of our country at the hearing concerning the disappearance of his son would be denied access to information as an American committed to our security and having dedicated your life to that cause. And I agree with Senator DeConcini. I hope that we can be of some service to you there. Thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you.
Representative McKeon, I do hope that you'll have the opportunity, take the opportunity to question the administration as well on that particular point, to which I think is quite appropriate. I wonder, I'm sorry that I didn't hear all your testimony, but if you could just comment again on the motivation for the alleged cover-up. You indicated you thought it was in the nature of the system. There were so many compartmented. Do you think it's a conscientious subterfuge, or is it just the inefficiency of the system?
Well, I can give you an example. I have met with some senior officials in the intelligence, with an associate of mine, a good friend of mine, Colonel Jack Bailey, wherein information was revealed at the meeting that had been given into the agency. But in talking to these senior individuals, those who were in charge, we found that that information had not been given to them, nor had they been briefed on certain cases.
Do you know why, though? What would be the motivation?
I can't answer that. You'd
Do you
have to
have-
answer the individual, sir. It just, to me,
I wonder if you have any opinion as to what the motivation might be for withholding.
I have an opinion, and I cannot back it up with fact, but I have an opinion, sir, that this issue for so long was practically non-existent in this country, because the U.S. government's position was there are no live Americans over there. There are individuals within the bureaucracy who established that position, in fact, at the lower levels, and they have maintained it throughout. This mindset may continue.
So the inference I can draw from your testimony is that you feel that they may have covered up to save themselves from embarrassment, or
Yes, sir.
that may be a motivation. Would that
Yes, sir,
be
that
a
could be a
generalization
possible
at least?
motivation. I believe so.
Thank you very much, Colonel Hopper. I appreciate very much your testimony.
Thank you.
And I hope that you can be with us when the administration testifies before us, because we will be asking direct questions as a consequence of your testimony.
Thank you.
Senator Dennis Ferry.
Senator Jeremiah Denton, a member of the committee, has joined us, and as you know, Senator, this is the second day of our hearings, and we would certainly appreciate any comments that you would care to make on a subject that you're so familiar with from your own commitment. We are moving along with the witnesses, but would give you this opportunity to proceed with your opening statement if you so desire. Or I can call on you later if you'd prefer after I call on another witness.
Mr. Chairman, I think I would prefer to sense the context of where we are right now and try to make my statement appropriate to that niche in the continuum. Thank you very much.
Fine. I would call on Miss Patricia B. Skelly, Chairman, Task Force Omega from Fairmont, Minnesota. Would you come to the witness stand and raise your hand? Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, would you please signify by stating, I do?
I do.
Thank you. We welcome you this morning. We look forward to your testimony, and I've been asked to suspend briefly to accommodate the, so I gather there's something wrong with our communication system, and that was a note, so if you'll just suspend for a moment, so will I, and we'll see if anybody rises to the occasion to do something about a problem that's not our problem. We'll call the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee to order. We are reconvening after our hearing last Tuesday. I want to introduce my colleagues. Of course, Senator DeConcini, who was with us on Tuesday, Representative Hendon, who joins us this morning, and Representative Smith. There'll be a number of our colleagues that will be coming in throughout the day. I apologize for the inconvenience of changing rooms again. I found myself taking a little extra walk this morning and then making the square back, but I do want to welcome you all on the continued proceedings on the issue of live sighting reports of Americans listed as missing in action in Southeast Asia. We have convened these hearings to afford the families of the missing in action an open forum on the reports, accounts, and emotions that surround the issue, an issue whose resolution is a priority of the United States government. As I stated on Tuesday, I believe that the Congress must take an active role in providing a resolution to the issue by working to gain the fullest possible accounting in the bright light of public scrutiny. It is important to note that our purpose this morning is not to make a determination or reach a final conclusion, but more importantly, to provide an opportunity for those who have information on the issue to make it known to your Congress and to the American people. On Tuesday, we've heard from 6 witnesses. Today, we will hear the balance from the non-government witnesses. The third day of hearings has been scheduled for the first of next week, at which time we will receive testimony from the government witnesses. I want to stress to all the witnesses that it is important that we stick to the facts as known, avoid completely personal comments, hearsay, or innuendos. I would ask each of the witnesses to be as specific as possible. I must warn that utterances of classified information in open session could be construed as a breach of national security. Arrangements have been made to provide any witnesses with information that is either classified or simply desired to be kept secret. The opportunity will be presented by the committee to you in a closed session at the conclusion of the regular witness list today. I would also remind you that we are going to limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Your written testimony, of course, can be submitted in its entirety for the record. I would again remind witnesses that all testimony will be given under oath. Our first witness this morning is Mr. Richard Herbert. Is Mr. Herbert with us this morning? Is that the pronunciation? Excuse me, Mr. Hebert. Would you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Please proceed, Mr. Hebert. We welcome you to the committee. We're sorry that the temperature has risen. We are attempting to get the building maintenance people to turn it down, but I think they turned it the other way when they saw the snowfall yesterday.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I appreciate this opportunity to appear before you today on a subject which is of signal importance to our government. Also, the families of our missing in action, veterans, the American public, and one in which I have a great personal interest. I am a commissioned officer in the United States Marine Corps on retired status and a Vietnam veteran, having served 2 combat tours there. I was a fighter pilot and flew 216 combat missions, most of them over Laos and North Vietnam. 2 of my former pilots are still listed among the missing in action. In trying to assist our government to resolve the tragic dilemma of over 2,400 Americans still missing from the Vietnam War, I have, during the past 5 years, set aside my private practice as a management consultant to almost exclusively devote my time to the issue. For the last 3 years, I have served in an unpaid status as president of the Center for POW MIA Accountability, a nonprofit, tax-exempt corporation chartered in the District of Columbia. The Center's sole purpose is to work for a resolution of the issue in concert with our government and legitimate interest groups from the private sector. The Center does not accept money from family members or from any government agency, nor does it endorse activities in conflict with United States government policy. In my testimony today, I wish to address a few activities emanating from the private sector which are considered productive, as well as some of those considered counterproductive. In early 1981, I conducted a detailed study and analysis of the POW-MIA question to define a course of action with the highest confidence level for success. This was done so as to attain the fullest possible accounting of all missing Americans. A total of 6 possible courses of action were considered, including private and paramilitary rescue operations and diplomatic efforts on a government-to-government basis. The recommended course of action with the highest probability of success was determined to be an intensive diplomatic effort to persuade the Vietnam and Lao governments to provide the fullest accounting based on humanitarian reasons. In order to place our government in a most favored negotiating position, it was also deemed essential that popular support of the American public be developed by implementing a media blitz to substantially increase public awareness on the issue. Unlike previous administrations, this scenario has largely been pursued by the current administration, and with very positive results, I may add. The government has perhaps the most skilled diplomatic team working the issue with the full support of a sophisticated technical pool of resources that the public has ever seen. As a complement to the government's efforts, Americans are indeed fortunate to have the expert services of the National League of Families representing their interests, as well as providing continuity of effort over these many difficult years. In the study I speak of, Private rescue operations were analyzed, but were rejected because they produced the least probability of success, with a confidence level of 0. Statistically, a 0 equates to an absolute impossibility. Anyone who believes in success under such formidable odds is insane. It has been my experience, through association with various illogical individuals of the Rambo persuasion, that their pursuit of the issue is for their own self-serving interests. Most often, it's for personal financial benefit at the expense of family members and a naive public, or to gain recognition that was somehow never earned. Such actions send false signals to the Vietnamese, leading them to believe America is severely divided on the POW-MIA issue, much in the same way that they were during the Vietnam War. The effect of their activities is exacerbated by the senseless bartering in artifacts gleaned from the trashing of crash sites. Putting a price on human remains and crash site artifacts is fueling a very ghoulish commerce, resulting in a series of tragic events. False and fabricated items such as animal bones, phony dog tags, and clothing remnants have surfaced. Further, scavengers are dividing real remains to increase the supply, and it is said that a human cranium has been sawed in half and offered for sale piece by piece. The majority of Americans buying artifacts do so for reasons other than to ease their own anguish or that of some unknown American family. Most of them are radical critics of the administration's allegedly slow action in determining the fate of our POWs and MIAs. Their wish is to somehow legitimatize their allegations by creating a smoking gun scenario. However, these artifacts so far have provided little forensic value to the investigative process. The buyers stimulate an already active market. They also generate additional false and bogus live sighting reports. They encourage unlawful forays into Laos, much to the anger of the Lao government, which consequently disrupt formal negotiations. Another task of the Center is to stay informed on Rambo-like rescue operations. Through the Center's network, we have achieved a large measure of success in filtering significant illegal activity from rumor. This information then is passed on to appropriate authorities for their consideration and possible use. The goal of all Americans is to see the POW-MIA issue to a just and honorable conclusion. The claim by critics of the government that there is a deliberate cover-up precluding the fullest possible accounting of POWs and MIAs is patently inane. The government has an expert functional task organization in place that consistently produces positive results. Additional cognizance or oversight authority, whether it be by commission or committee or other forum, is unnecessary. The allegations made by critics of the administration, including those currently under litigation, are based on nothing new, but rather on rumor, hearsay, false assumptions, and biased interpretations. Some allegations relate to reports contained in the Department of Defense's 15-volume series on uncorrelated information. These documents were released under the Freedom of Information Act several years ago and have been available to the public. To cite them as proof of government ineptness and deliberate cover-up is ridiculous. If the critics have any new, authentic evidence to offer, it is their bound duty to turn it over to the government with haste. If not to DIA, then certainly to this committee. To withhold possible useful information in their own selfish interest and at the expense of family members and concerned citizens is repulsive.
Mr. Hebert, your 5 minutes has expired. I wonder if you could kind of consolidate your remaining remarks and proceed.
Yes, sir, I certainly will. Solution of the POW-MIA issue is a profound moral obligation of all concerned Americans, and a successful outcome is solely dependent on the best judgments and actions of the United States government. The issue transcends all personal desires other than to see it to a humane and honorable conclusion.
Thank you
Thank
very
you,
much, Mr. Hebert. Do you have an opinion whether Americans are still being held against their will captive in Southeast Asia?
Yes, I do. I think that the probability of live Americans still being over there is certainly one that can't be ruled out.
And your personal opinion then is not to rule it out?
Absolutely, sir.
Do you have any confidential information regarding the issue of POWMAIs?
No, sir, I do not.
Have you traveled in either Laos or Vietnam?
No, I've flown over both of them.
You indicated in your written testimony that scavengers who pry upon the remains of American servicemen for their own financial gain are usually Lao anti-government guerrillas. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
How do you know this to be the case?
Well, based on a post-action field report that we had of one of our members that made over there last year, and he traveled to Kuala Lumpur, Singapore, and Bangkok, and had permission and approval, and was escorted by members of the embassy in Bangkok to the refugee sites, the refugee camps, and it was reported to him from reliable sources that that was primarily the case, that the majority of the scavengers are anti-Lao resistance.
You indicated in your testimony that you felt that some of the well-meaning efforts that were not necessarily government-connected were in effect, I think I can paraphrase your general term, taking advantage of some of the families, and I think you used the word naive public. My question is, these people are obviously genuinely interested in trying to clear up the doubt.
I agree.
How do we define that fine line between good intentions and something that goes a little further and suggests self-serving?
Well, I think that it's obvious that it has to be based on a relationship of trust and confidence in our government.
Well, there's been allegations that our government has not been totally responsive. They have not attempted to follow up with the appropriate detail, and as a consequence, individuals have chosen and seen fit in the effort of attempting to shed some light on it to initiate their own contacts and their own information sources.
Well, that's true, and there is a great deal of activity towards that effort by private groups.
Can you give the committee any specific instances where you are aware of POW/MII advocacy groups that, in your opinion, may be taking advantage of the situation and the public?
Yes, sir, I can. In 1981, I was requested to join a group of individuals under the guidance and leadership at that time of retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Bo Greitz. And ostensibly this was for a rescue mission tacitly approved and sanctioned by the U.S. government. I went to the training site in Florida with the responsibility at that time of doing the necessary air planning for a cross-border rescue operation. It was apparent to me after perhaps 3 hours into their top secret briefing that they were holding that was also open to the media and had representatives from one of the major TV networks and representatives from several newspapers there, that what they had proposed was, from a military operational standpoint, aside from the fact that there may or may not have been a target site, was absolutely ridiculous. Further, their designated target site was a site that I had flown over many, many times during my combat tour over there in Vietnam, 69 and 70. And it was customary that before we went out on our missions, we had a daily intelligence briefing, and all of the suspected or known prisoner of war campsites in Laos were plotted on our charts and the maps that we carried in our cockpit. And I brought this to the attention of a colleague of mine, and I said, I still believe that I have that site, that particular site, marked on my chart back in my effects. And he said that he did too, and we compared after we left the that particular endeavor of Greitz's. We compared our charts, and it was a fact that the site that Greitz had designated was an old POW campsite that was well known to the authorities and one that which we had flown over many, many times.
Well, couldn't that just have been one coincidence as opposed to the generalization that your testimony infers that advocacy groups, which means one would suggest more than one, have perhaps been misleading? I'd like to see if, in your opinion, this is just one instance, or if it, in your opinion, occurs more regularly.
Instances, Senator, that I am aware of, and specifically of two groups now that are ostensibly training for paramilitary operations.
My time is up. I have to leave for about 20 minutes, and I'm going to ask the ranking minority member, my colleague Senator Cranston, to take over the hearing at this time. And we very much appreciate your presence here this morning. I might advise you that when the hearing was opened on Tuesday, we established a procedure, and as you know, we had Representative McKeon and Representative Bilirakis, as well as Senator DeConcini and myself on the trip. As a consequence, we've asked them to participate as members, so to speak, free to make opening statements and question witnesses. We've had requests from other senators off the committee, as well as House members. I've instructed them that they're free to join us at the podium, but they're not free to question witnesses. They may appear as witnesses and make a statement as a sworn witness. With that, I would ask you to come over and preside until I can get back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll just stay right here. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you at these very important hearings.
I'm sure you have an opening statement. You've not had
Yes.
an opportunity to make that,
Yes.
and then the questions. Thank you.
Very briefly, let me just say that I sympathize very greatly, as do all Americans, with those families who, to this day, cannot be certain what happened to their brothers, sons, or fathers. I feel very strongly about this issue, and I appreciate and respect the very deep sentiment and concern about it throughout our country and in my state of California. As long as questions remain about the fate of our POWs and MIAs, we must do our very best to pursue this issue and to answer those questions. I'm committed to that end. Only when the POW MIA issue is resolved can there be a resolution of the issue on our relationship with Vietnam. Without concrete cooperation from the governments of Vietnam and Laos, I'm afraid we will not be able to resolve the many lingering questions about the fate of our service personnel. It's my sincere hope that these hearings will contribute to both short-term and long-term resolutions to the many complexities and emotions involved in this very perplexing and troubling issue. I look forward to reviewing the testimony of the witnesses at all these hearings, Tuesdays and the others, and to working with my colleagues in both houses as we continue to seek answers. I do not have any questions at this time, but I'd like now to yield to my colleague, Senator DeConcini, for whatever questions he may have.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Mr. Ebert, I want to preface my questions with the fact that there are so many allegations, cross-allegations, cover-up. People under oath have testified here. I don't know if you were here at the last hearings.
Yes, I was.
One of them, Mr. Barnes, has submitted to medical and highly technical procedures as to the veracity of his testimony, and it leaves doubts in people's minds. And I'm like you. In your statement, I can't believe that our government would participate in anything that would be of the nature of not full disclosure, and I find it absolutely repugnant to me However, notwithstanding that, we're charged here, I believe, with an effort, sincere effort, to try to bring it to a head so we as committee people can make decisions of who's telling the truth and who may not be. And we're certainly fallible human beings, and we may make mistakes. And Mr. Childress, I have great respect for him. I think he's attempted to do the best he can with the circumstances that he has. I'm not sure he has all the information, and I'm not prepared to make any allegations that he's been involved in any mismanagement of his office or his responsibility. Nevertheless, the doubt is there, and the doubt and allegations are raised about your relationship with Mr. Childress. And in light of that opening statement, I'd like to ask you what that relationship is with Mr. Childress and the Center for POW MIA Accountability, Inc.
It's as a private citizen and on a casual basis. I had approached Mr. Childress approximately a year and a half ago, and before that time, I had been visiting DIA and Lieutenant Colonel Venanzi, and also Mr. Childress. And I thought that to streamline things, that it would be better just to go ahead and deal with one individual as opposed to three or a couple of separate units. So I asked him if there was any problem if I dealt directly with him, and he said none whatsoever. So that established our relationship.
Has he put you in contact with any people that provided information or funds to your center?
No, no, sir.
An allegation was made by John Meade of Sunnyvale, California, that on January 13, 1984, and I will ask Mr. Childress this, of course, that Mr. Childress revealed that the center was his, quote, investigative group, quote. Are you familiar with that allegation?
No, sir, I am not. And
Is there any truth to that allegation?
none whatsoever.
Have you ever been asked by Mr. Childress or anyone in DIA or the United States government to do any investigation on their behalf?
No, sir, never. And if I were, I might add that I would refuse. We are a private, non-profit organization.
Would you refuse information that you have to turn over
No,
to them?
no.
But you would refuse doing any chore or task that they might ask you
that-
to do?
that's correct.
Other than just hand over what you might already have?
Yes, sir.
What, do you have any clearance agreement with the federal government of any nature? Have you been
None whatsoever.
cleared in a classified nature?
None whatsoever. When I retired from the Marine Corps, I had a final top secret clearance, and
Do you have access to?
no, sir, I do not
classified
have
information?
access, and I wouldn't want access. It's not necessary.
So well, it's not necessary. What do you mean it isn't necessary?
Well, I don't think it's absolutely necessary for people to have access to classified information. I think that in those cases where there may be information that is classified, that it's up to the originator or the one that assigned that classification to go ahead and dispense or release what information or portion of that which is not classified.
Do you have doubts, Mr. Abert, of the testimony given by Major Smith, Sergeant McIntyre, and Scott Barnes as to the information that they've turned over and the testimony they give, that they were told not to talk about this and not to pursue it?
Do I have any doubts?
Yes.
As to what, the veracity of their allegation?
The veracity of those statements?
Yes, sir, I do.
What basis do you have find your doubts?
Well, this is my own personal opinion, but I have read both the complaint by the complainants and the government's answer to the suit, and it just seems to me that it's totally implausible. And I think that in the government's response to the complaint that is on file in a matter of public record, I think that each individual allegation was very, very well and closely addressed.
Were you here last Tuesday for the?
Yes, sir, I was.
Did you hear that testimony
Yes,
under
I
oath
did.
to those gentlemen? Do you feel, after listening to that testimony, that has no basis?
I think that it should require further, scrutiny.
Inquiry?
Yes, inquiry, scrutiny.
You feel enough was presented that notwithstanding your feeling in mind that this just can't be true, we couldn't be involved in such a thing as a government, that there was enough evidence or statements made that we ought to continue to pursue at least these allegations, call them that only for right now.
Well, those that on the surface appear to be true, and others are, in my estimation, patently false. And whether or not they were given under oath still doesn't alter that opinion.
Can you recall to us which ones that were given that you feel are patently false, just offhand?
Yes, sir. I believe it's ludicrous to think that a major general in the United States Army would chastise one of his subordinate officers in the manner that was described by Major Smith and threaten him with, I believe, the words that Major Smith stated was something to the effect that if he wanted to make lieutenant colonel, he better forget what.
Your feeling is the major general just don't ever do that sort of thing.
Well, I don't think that. I don't think that that any commissioned officer, any officer, whether it's to a superior or a subordinate, what happened to trust and confidence?
Well,
And
yes, that's a good question.
Yes.
That's a good question. I'm glad you asked it. I'm not as confident as you are that major generals are any more pure than senators or congressmen or judges or any of us in society.
Well,
and that they make mistakes and they get carried away with their power, and sometimes they abuse it. Not saying that this is the case,
Yes.
but I don't find my confidence level quite as high as yours that a major general or any officer just absolutely would not abuse his subordinate. I know, just serving as second lieutenant, I had a colonel that I felt was abusing me. Probably I was out of line because I was a young whippersnapper and thought I knew everything that had to be known about the military, and I probably deserved it. But I certainly thought he was out of line. So did some other officers, and we filed a complaint of no value whatsoever, of course. Nothing happened to it, except I didn't get promoted to captain, but I don't think that was really why. But nevertheless, I had little experience just serving a small time, though I would question. Let me just ask you regarding
Well,
the source.
let me state
Yes,
one
sir.
thing, if I may, Senator. What I had reference to is those of us in the military and out of the military, if we're serving in a structured environment, on occasion, have to do a rug dance, and we get chewed out. But that wasn't what I was addressing. Perhaps it was lost in the conversation.
Excuse me.
What I was addressing that Major Smith alleges in his statement the other day, and also in his written statement as part of the complaint, that gives the implication that there was a major general in the United States Army that was precipitating a cover-up. And that's what I think is utterly ridiculous.
But that is only based on your feeling that major generals wouldn't do that.
Yes, sir, going
Yeah,
back
no-
to special
no
trust.
factual information that could have taken place.
I beg your pardon, sir?
No factual
No,
information that
no.
you have. One last question, Mr. Chairman, and I'll yield. There was a group meeting in Phoenix known as Project Freedom last year, and or more than a year ago. And were you present there?
No, sir, I was not.
Are you aware that someone came there representing your group?
No, sir. I'm
You're not? Okay. Just for the record, someone did come there, and I will attempt to secure his name, and indicated they represented the center, and acknowledged that the center had a political mission, and that it was going to go out of business in November of '84. What is your intention with your group as far as termination of your organization?
Well, our charter is such that we will stay as a viable entity and in the public service or in the public's eye until the issue is closed.
Are you paid by the center?
No, sir, I am unpaid.
Are there any paid employees?
No, sir, there are not.
Mr. Chairman, I have a couple of questions I'll submit to Mr. Ebert and ask if he can answer them at his leisure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dennis. We're pleased that some concerned members of the House of Representatives are with us in this hearing, and I'll now turn to each of them. First, Congressman Mckeon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. In the interest of the courtesy you've extended to me, I have only two quick questions, and that first observation would be, Mr. Hebert, that you have a real advantage on me in seeing this issue with the clarity that you see it. And I have real difficulty in that, and I wish that I had the understanding of complete right and complete wrong of all the players in this question. You mentioned a POW camp that was known to you in your flights to Laos, as I understand it in your testimony.
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Were any POWs ever rescued from that camp, and if so, how many, and if not, why not?
Not to my knowledge, but let me clarify what I had stated and submitted before. We were in an extremely high-threat area in Laos. It was 7 times more threatening, life-threatening than flying combat flights over Vietnam, South Vietnam, or even North Vietnam. And all of the intelligence in that particular area was either generated or funneled through the 7th Air Force headquarters in Saigon. And I was attached, not personally, but my unit was attached to the 7th Air Force under operational control. And as a matter of daily routine, we had to update the known or suspected POW campsites. And because the Laotians and whomever was in charge of these campsites would consistently and constantly move these people around. And the reason for this is because we were primarily responsible for strike control on known or suspected targets. And of course, we didn't want to go ahead and put in a strike on our own people that might be possibly detained in one of these campsites.
So basically, you're saying that no one was ever rescued, is what you're saying?
No.
Yes. And no real attempts were made?
Well, of course, this was still during the war. This was in 69 and 70. As far as attempts, I do know of operations that were being conducted over there, clandestine operations, and whether or not part of their mission or task was to rescue POWs is something I'm not familiar with.
I don't want to put words in your mouth. I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying. No attempts were made and no one was ever rescued in the other known campsites that you were aware of? Okay.
Yeah.
You mentioned in your testimony, and I just want to get your feeling on this
Yes, sir.
to help me see it with the clarity with which you see it. You said, assuming that such an operation, a rescue operation, were implemented, what assurance is there that possible POWs whose locations were not known would survive the aftermath of a rescue? It's likely their welfare would be in jeopardy. Is their welfare not in jeopardy now, and therefore a rescue would place them in jeopardy? Or what level on the spectrum here should we be concerned about their current condition? Is their current condition superior to the jeopardy that a rescue operation would place them in? Or how do I understand this?
It's my judgment that if there are live Americans over there now, most certainly, whatever their physical well-being is or their state, that in the event of a private rescue attempt, which is militarily unsound and just almost unsupportable from a logistics point of view, that under those circumstances, if one did take place and they were successful in rescuing 3, 5, 25, or whatever the case may be, what would happen to any other possible ones that might be in other sites that were unknown to the rescuers? And it's reasonable to assume that any POWs that may be held over there against their will are not in a classical or incarcerated in a classical prison environment for several considerations. It's too obvious, And also, economically, it's very expensive. It's my opinion that POWs would more than likely be turned over to the cognizance or control of village chiefs, and they would be dispersed out in the deep jungle and into several different areas. And it compounds the situation.
I appreciate that. I'm just trying to
Yes,
get
sir.
at your thought process on this. Let's say that you were a POW in Laos today. From your frame of reference, as you're speaking with me here, would you prefer to stay in that condition as opposed to having a rescue mission attempted?
That's a difficult question, Mr. McKeon.
Very insightful to me, too, in relevance of your testimony. Basically, as I understand what you've said, you'd prefer to be left alone.
No, sir. I said it was a very difficult question. No, I said, no, I would very definitely want to be rescued.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I understand that Chairman Murkowski has asked that the other two members of the House who are here, who were not on the trip, not engage in questioning at this stage because we have so many witnesses. So if we may, we'll now proceed to the next witness, and you will both have opportunity to submit questions in writing, and perhaps at the end, if there's a given time, you would have that opportunity. The next witness was scheduled to be Mr. Gerry Mooney of Wolf Point, Montana. I understand, Mr. Mooney, that you wanted to give your testimony in closed session. Is that correct? Mr. Mooney, did you want to testify in closed session?
Yes, sir. It's required that I testify in closed
I
session.
think we should then proceed with other witnesses and defer calling you until we've dealt with the other witnesses, so we don't have to clear the room and then.
Yeah, thank you,
pull people
sir.
back in. Thank you very much. So our next witness will be Colonel Earl P. Hopper, U.S. Army retired, from Glendale, Arizona. Colonel, thank you for being with us. Would you please rise, and do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. Do you have any?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before the committee today to share with you some thoughts relating to our American prisoners of war who have not returned from the Vietnam War. I'm Colonel Earl Hopper. I retired from the Army in 1969 after 29 and a half years of service. My oldest son, Lieutenant Colonel Earl Hopper, Jr., U.S. Air Force, was shot down on the North Vietnamese Laos border on 10 January 1968. He was carried by the U.S. Air Force as missing in action until 14 July of 1982, and then under the Reagan administration, he was declared dead. Subsequently, the Department of Justice reviewed his case, however, and determined that he was in fact captured and was a prisoner of war. Upon my retirement from the service, I became very active in the POW issue, both in Arizona and nationally. I was a member of the board of directors of the National League of Families of American Prisoners and Missing in Southeast Asia from 1973 to 1984. And during that time, I served 1 year as the League's executive director here in the Washington area and 6 years as chairman of the board of directors. I remain a member of the League, and I also serve on the board of directors of Task Force Omega Incorporated, which is a POW-oriented organization devoted to the return of our live American prisoners and the remains of those who have died. It is my personal opinion that American prisoners of war, servicemen and civilians, were left behind in Southeast Asia, and that some of those Americans are still being held today against their will in Southeast Asia by the communist governments of Vietnam and Laos. I wish to enter for the record, Mr. Chairman, 2 Central Intelligence Agency documents, one of them dated 28 March 1970, the other one 25 November 1970. The subject are enemy prisons in Laos. These 2 documents prove beyond a doubt that the Central Intelligence Agencies knew American prisoners were in Lao prison camps in those days, in 1970.
Have those been declassified?
They are unclassified. Yesterday, they were unclassified, approved for release in June 1978.
They will appear in the record without objection.
It's significant that these reports give the number of American prisoners held at specific locations in Laos. More significant, however, is the CIA's designation of these camps as confirmed prison camps, and that the terms of information contained therein, they state that in order for a prison camp to be confirmed, it must be reported by 2 or more independent sources. What I'm doing here is trying to establish the validity of these prison camps. And they give, in several locations, the number of American prisoners in those prison camps. These reports are unclassified and were approved for release, as I said, in 1978. Undoubtedly, subsequent reports from 1970 up to 1973, or even later, at least double the number of American prisoners held in these confirmed prison camps. And they would be, on an unclassified or classified basis, available to this committee, I'm sure. I also wish to submit for the record 2 other documents. One is a document from the hearings of the House Select Committee on Missing Persons in Southeast Asia, February and March 1976. The other one is a Defense Intelligence Agency document dated 7 December 1977 to the Department of Defense. Thank you. These 2 documents provide statements by Lao communist officials, who speak of and acknowledge American prisoners held by communist forces in Laos. There are, I'm sure, other documents available to the committee through your research that would substantiate these statements also. But as you read these official documents, you can see that American prisoners were held by the Pathet Lao through 1973, by Lao officials' own acknowledgement and by their own statements. The questions are, why weren't these prisoners returned, and where are they today? Someone knows the answer to that question, and the burden of responsibility to obtain those answers rests squarely on the shoulders of the United States government and their intelligence agencies. To date, they have not fulfilled that responsibility. It's an area which I hope you and your committee, Mr. Chairman, will take a sincere interest and further investigate in detail. I've just attempted here very briefly to establish the fact that American prisoners of war were known by the U.S. government to have been in Lao prison camps and that they were left there behind at the cessation of hostilities. This leads me into another area I consider to be the greatest weakness, in fact, the greatest tragedy of this POW issue: the inability to obtain conclusive, timely evidence that these American prisoners are still being held. From what I have been told by high-level government and intelligence officials, and what I have read, on the ground, human or covert intelligence capability in Vietnam and Laos has not existed. As recent as October the 9th, 1985, Mr. Chairman, Robert McFarland, at that time the National Security Advisor to President Reagan, stated that, quote, there have to be live Americans there. He went on to say, there is more that we ought to be doing than we are. What we need to do is to have better human intelligence in Vietnam. Now we don't. I wouldn't pretend to you that we've done enough to even start, and that's bad, and that's a failure, end quote. And I submit for the record a transcript of the tape recording in which he is quoted as making those statements, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. That will go in the record.
The thing that bothers me in that statement is that Mr. McFarland was with the president daily, and he was responsible to keep the president briefed on the POW problem. I wonder if he informed the president of his feelings and shared his thoughts with him. I have noted a sworn statement by a very reputable returned prisoner of war and retired Navy captain that even Dick Childers, who was on Mr. McFarland's staff, also said he felt there were live POWs still over there. Human intelligence capabilities focusing on live POWs should be subjected to detailed and extensive examination by your committee. It is apparent it is not functioning to its fullest, or it is non-existent. Another area deserving your attention, Mr. Chairman, is the treatment of Asian refugees who voluntarily come forth with information on live prisoners of war. Since the Vietnamese and Laotian refugees started fleeing their homes and settling in free countries all over the world, over 800 have reported firsthand eyewitness information on live POWs. I have, over the years, talked to a number of these individuals who have complained of their treatment by U.S. government debriefers, or more appropriately, probably interrogators. The first complaint that I witnessed was as early as 1978, and the latest was 1984 when I spoke to an individual. These refugees complained of intimidation, threats, insult, degradation, and even of being accused of lying and being communist. Because of this, many sources of live eyewitness reports will never submit themselves to further debriefing after their first or second session with U.S. government representatives. I submit for the record, again, Mr. Chairman, a letter written by Madame Le An, a Vietnamese lady who lives here in Maryland. And in this letter, she outlines some very few complaints of these refugees. Madame An has been cooperative with both U.S. government agencies, POW-oriented organizations, and with the National League of Families as a collector of information from the Vietnamese all over the world, as well as acting as translator and interpreter. I believe Madame An probably knows the situation better, and I'm referring to the refugee reports and the treatment of the refugees better than any other individual. And I would recommend to you, Mr. Chairman, that Madame Le An and some of the refugees who have these complaints be called before this committee so that you can hear them firsthand. I'd like to submit this letter for the record.
That will go on the record.
In conclusion, I wish to commend you and your committee for taking an interest in this POW crisis and for holding these hearings. The overwhelming weight of the evidence establishes beyond a shadow of a doubt, in my opinion, that live Americans are still being held in Southeast Asia. But, as stated by the U.S. government officials, after 13 years, they have been unable to provide conclusive evidence to support this fact. Why? It's a tragic situation which has to be answered soon. And the question this committee should be asking and continue to asking until this POW problem is resolved is why? 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 I fear our live American prisoners are being held by the communist governments of Vietnam and Laos and are being forgotten to death. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I especially wish to express my appreciation to my senator from Arizona, Senator DeConcini, for his sincere interest in our live POWs and his dedication to resolve this crisis and bring our men home.
Thank you very much, Colonel Hopper. A son couldn't have a more wonderful father in terms of your perseverance and your loyalty and your effort to do what you can about his fate. Do you have any theory as to why Americans would treat Laotians or Vietnamese who came forward with information allegedly about POWs in the way that you indicate they've been treated?
I believe General Tai answered that question in his testimony before the Subcommittee on Asian Pacific Affairs when he said that there was a mindset which contributed, wherein efforts were contributed more towards discrediting the source than towards following up the truthfulness of the information those sources gave. And I think General Tye's experience in DIA, his opinion is highly credible.
Thank you very much, Dennis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Colonel Hopper, thank you for those remarks, and let me just echo what Senator Cranston said. I know from some time your dedication to this effort, not only in behalf of your son, but on behalf of other families and those missing in action. I know you've accomplished exhaustive research on this issue you and I have discussed many times, including the category of MIAs as to their military specialty. In particular, I'd like to know how many electronic warfare officers were repatriated and how many were lost from your research. And were these men lost in Vietnam or Laos? Can you give that to the committee?
The information that I had was that in one particular instance during a major bombing of the Hanoi Haiphong area by B-52s, of 10 aircraft that went down, only one electronic warfare officer was returned.
What conclusion do you draw from that, if any?
I draw the conclusion that the enemy was very interested in personnel who had this high-tech experience and knowledge and education, not only in electronic warfare, but also in nuclear warfare and other areas.
It was a motive not to return those people if, in fact, they were alive.
I think the probability is very high that those certain individuals could have received specific, careful attention and could have been retained and for further use by the enemy. Yes, sir.
You've also done research regarding information that you've shared with us concerning F-111 pilots. I believe you stated that none were returned in 1973 or prior to that. What significance, if any, do you place in that, Colonel?
There again, the F-111 was a very sophisticated aircraft. It was a new aircraft, and it was designed as a nuke bomb carrier. And those individuals had received some very special training and education. And I believe those individuals, too, were probably earmarked, since we did not receive them.
Your information also points out that there were none of the released POWs were amputees or severely burned cases or severe mental cases. What significance do you place in that?
Yes, sir. We did not receive any amputees back among the returned POWs, and I think you would have to agree, given the type of warfare we were fighting over there, with the high explosives, the grenades, the booby traps, the high-velocity small arms, which when hitting a man would take off his whole arm or leg, that some of these men would have had to have been captured and end up as prisoners of war. The same is true of severe burn cases. And I believe you would have to consider the treatment that our returned POWs recited to us upon their return, that all men could not mentally stand up to the type of inhumane mental and physical treatment that they received. Yet we didn't get men back that were on that border of becoming vegetables. Let me put it that way.
I would ask that those coming in be seated. There's a few empty seats available. We have the next witness before us, Ms. Patricia B. Skelly, Chairman, Task Force Omega, Fairmont, Minnesota. Ms. Skelly, we welcome you to the committee. We look forward to your testimony, and you may begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
May I ask you to pull the microphones up a little closer, and perhaps you can speak a little louder, just maybe you can speak into them a little more.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of this committee. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Patricia B. Skelly. I am Chairman of the Board of Directors of Task Force Omega, a prisoner of war organization that is dedicated to the return of all Americans from Southeast Asia, both alive and dead. During the time frame that I was the Minnesota State Coordinator for the National League of Families, a small group of us, family members and concerned citizens alike, began doing some research into the information available from various government agencies. We collected many types of documentations and computer printouts, all of them either not classified or declassified. Under the Freedom of Information Act, we received some very important computer printouts from the Defense Intelligence Agency and the State Department. We also received computer runs or other information, documentation from National Archives, the Central Intelligence Agency, casualty offices, the various departments of the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Personnel Records Section, St. Louis, JCRC, and the CIL, Central Identification Laboratory. I would like to address some of the areas that we have done research into.
Please do
and
so.
what we have found. In regard to the DIA computer printouts, which is from their automated database, their automated file of everyone who is missing and unaccounted for, to include returnees, escapees, bodies recovered, in addition to POWs, MIAs, those people killed in action, body not recovered, AWOL deserters, detainees, etc. We did an extensive analysis, comparison of some 10 documents received in about a 2.5-year period, beginning in 1977, going through 1980. Based on this research, we found many, many discrepancies within the DIA system. These things ranged from very simple errors where somebody who was putting the information into the computer did not take the time to make sure that they were putting in accurate information. We found other errors that were just negligence, and in some cases I would consider very severe negligence. This information was compiled into a research document along with the backup comparison information and sent to Admiral Paulson, who was then the Deputy Director for Collections of DIA. We never did receive any substantial reply to our questions. In regard to casualty offices, we've had a very good working relationship with many of them. We have learned, though, that they do maintain files, active files on men and women who are listed as POW or MIA. The killed in action, body not recovered files are kept in the Personnel Records Section, St. Louis. When they have to work on an individual who is listed as killed in action, body not recovered, they have to request that man's file or woman's file from St. Louis. They can only have it in their possession for a limited length of time, and they may or may not receive the entire file. In regard to the Central Identification Laboratory, for the last 3 years, they have requested from individual family members copies of their next of kin's medical records and dental records because the CIL does not have them or has only parts. This in itself is critical because this is the organization that is charged with identifying remains when they come back. In the case of a man whose remains were returned very recently, the CIL contacted the mother when they found out his name was among them and his remains were reported to be in this group. The mother did not have access to the medical and dental records, and we have been told by her that the CIL told her they did not have any of his records. JCRC, I have recently learned, maintains files on some 3,500 individuals who are unaccounted for. Since the official number is 2441, I would wonder who these other files belong to, and I would think that it would be worth checking into. We know that there is information maintained in the DIA automated database that is not contained in the records or databases of other agencies. We know that there is information in the State Department computer base that DIA does not have, and so forth.
I wonder, Mrs. Skelly, you exceeded 5 minutes. If you could
I'm
kind of
almost done, sir.
summarize your remaining remarks, we would be appreciative.
We believe that whether it's a part of an independent commission or an independent repository, that the information located in all these various areas should be combined so that there is ready, easy access to the people who have a need for it. Task Force Omega has always worked with and is more than willing to work with anybody who is willing to work with us, inside and outside of the government. I would like to say one other thing. We are not and have not been given any classified information. I am submitting for the record a copy of the research material sent in to Admiral Paulson in 1982, copies of the two most important DIA computer runs, one alphabetical by man's last name, the other one chronological by incident date, the two most important State Department computer runs, one by branch of service, the other one by, home of record, and one by branch of service, country of loss. I am submitting a fifth one that is home of record from the Defense Department. I am also submitting the keys for the State Department and the DIA runs. I believe that you and your staff have a right to this information, but I would caution you that there is information here contained in them that is sensitive in nature, in that it refers to individuals and what happened or may have happened to them. And we do not know what the families in all cases have been told. And because of its sensitive nature, we trust that you will handle it in the appropriate manner as we have for the years that we have had them. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Ms. Skelly. Senator DeConcini has had to leave, but he has requested that he be permitted to submit questions to you for the record, so those will be forthcoming. I wonder if you can provide for the record the discrepancies which you feel are significant questions as to the present status of any servicemen that may be unaccounted for.
Okay, let me word it this way, because there are a wide variety of discrepancies and errors. Some of the most critical discrepancies fall in the line of, there is one man who was shot down in 1968. He had an arbitrary status change to killed in action, body not recovered, in 1978, based on a presumptive finding of death. The data remarks column on the DIA computer runs, and these are their working documents, by the way, says, and I quote, released 25 September 1972. I know the man's family. I know his wife. When we uncovered that, and it was just really by an accident that that was found, I called his wife and I asked her what she knew. I told her what we'd uncovered and apologized for talking to her over the phone rather than in person. He was never released to her knowledge. He was never returned to this country alive. He has not been accounted for.
Would you, can you identify the circumstances so that we can request that information from the administration?
Yes, sir. It's in the research material. He is one of the
Well,
cases that's
I know,
outlined.
but we're not going to have time to pull that out
I will
ourselves.
be happy to provide the name for
Would
you.
do you care to provide it for the record at this time?
Yes, sir. It's Alan Fellows, Air Force pilot, shot down in Laos.
And there's been no accountability of any kind?
No, sir.
Either
I finally did get a verbal answer from a staffer at DIA, and they said, oh, it was an error. My point is, in this particular case, that if they are looking at these memory joggers, the data remarks column, to instantly call up the man's case or woman's case, and they see there a comment that's just released in 1972, then they are not going to pursue any other information based on what they are reading there. To me, that is negligence. There are people who should show up on the computer runs in their data files, and they do not. Mrs. Ruth Brillianthan testified Tuesday. Her husband's case is a classic case. There are many, many other ones, sir. The point is that there needs to be some place where all the information can be put, known that it is accurate, combined from other agencies, and dealt with. Because quite frankly, at this point, based on knowing what the State Department has, which DIA does not have, the things that DIA has that other agencies do not have, and so forth, all of them, I don't see where the government can stipulate with a surety the fate of anybody who is unaccounted for today. I'd like to make one other statement, sir, that I had left out. Mrs. Griffith Tuesday said that the families have the most to gain or lose in the accounting process. I would like to state that she is wrong. The men and women who have the most to gain or lose are those who are prisoner missing and unaccounted for. The rest of us really don't matter. They are the ones that matter and have the most to gain and lose by our efforts.
Can you tell me your particular organization representing the Omega Task Force, how it works with or is in deference with the League of Families? Is there, do you operate in a different area, or do you complement one another, or do you have substantial differences?
I think that we complement each other. We do have some differences. We have some philosophic differences. We will work with anybody, and we do work with the League on certain things. We definitely work with family members, state and regional coordinators, and so forth, and we will continue to. Any help that we can give anyone on this issue, we are more than willing to do. We are also willing, and I want you to fully realize this, we are willing to work with any of the government agencies, but we wish it to be a two-way street, not just a one-way channel.
Thank you very much. I very much appreciate your testimony. I would call on Representative McKeon, and then I'm going to call on Senator Denton to question the witness, and then I would call on, then I would call on you to make your opening statement. Okay, do you have any questions, Senator Denton, of the witness?
No.
All right. I would excuse the witness, and I would call on Senator Denton. Our next witnesses after Senator Jerry Denton's statement would be Representative Gilman and Representative Solomon, who I believe are here. Senator Denton, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I regret not having been able to be here yesterday. As you know, we had conflicts today, but I did want to appear. I have read the testimony from yesterday. I commend you and the others for your interest and leadership in taking the initiative to hold these hearings. I want to preliminarily recognize Colonel Robert L. Howard, an Alabamian, who wears our nation's highest decoration, the Medal of Honor. I commend him for his distinguished service to our country, and I join with all of us in welcoming you here. I would like to make a few remarks. I have no particular advantage in intelligence, that is my own intelligence, my brain, but I have had a long background of involvement in this problem, which began well before I was shot down. Our government was curious, relatives, wives, mothers.
Senator Denton, could you speak a little closer to the mic? Thank you.
wives, mothers, fathers were interested back in the early 60s in finding out and getting accountability for those who were shot down, captured, otherwise missing in Southeast Asia. I was involved in that to a degree. I had to attend a survival school, survival escape, rescue evasion school, at which they gave us classified information. There was a dearth of good information about the treatment of the prisoners and a lot of unaccountability even at that time. Since that time, my wife and I and many of my friends have been heavily involved in this. My interest in it has not diminished because I have been fortunate enough to return to the United States. It has been increased. But I want to try to give a slant on it from my point of view because it is long-standing and perhaps will contribute to more progress than we are now making in achieving what we want, accountability. The most undeniable feature of the POW-MIA issue was and remains emotionalism. That was in my case, my family's case, everybody else's case involved. That servicemen may still be alive in Vietnam is enough to cause emotional heights to be reached by many people. And even the most dispassionate Americans, and whatever their side, anti-war or support the war during the war, were united in that concern. Now we have catalysts to increase the concern of those who are left holding the bag, as it were. The war is, quote, over, yet we continue to hear reports of the sightings of male Caucasians, discovered dog tags, uncovered bone fragments that add to the misinformation and information that have together confused the issue from the beginning, and particularly the beginning starting at the end of the war. In an attempt to sift through that massive information, even before the war was over, Congress started establishing commissions, and many visits have been made to North Vietnam, some before the war was over, by officials of this government, some of them not very tasty missions, in my belief. But since that time, a number of very constructive efforts by senators and representatives, and they go back to Sonny Montgomery and others many years ago, and recently Chairman Mckeon and Senator DeConcini were among those interested, effective lawmakers which tried to contribute to the solution of the problem and did return with 2 young children for which we can rejoice, who were reunited with their mother. I commend their efforts and some of their results. Now, I did live with the Vietnamese government environment for almost 8 years, and I am a student of international affairs by training since high school. I am interested in it, and I would make these remarks. The Vietnamese Communist government is patient. The Vietnamese Communist government is unscrupulous, including having a great propensity to lie and a great propensity to ask questions like Stalin asked when they are pressured to produce something. And Stalin asked, when asked to desist in his persecution of the Catholic Church, he said, "How many divisions does the Pope have?" Their cooperation with our effort is going to depend on what leverage we have to bring to bear against the Vietnamese Communist government. And I believe that in order to achieve that leverage, it would not be useless for us to muster the emotionalism, the resentment against that government, which is not accounting for our people, because as unscrupulous as they are not so stupid as to ignore the significance of the development of broad resentment against them, because they have to contemplate, aside from that resentment, what other form will U.S. pressure take? They have to think about that. It can be economic, it can be diplomatic, it can be psychological, it could be aid that the United States musters from others or from itself to some of those whom they are still overrunning in Southeast Asia at the behest of the Soviet government. That nation is getting tired, economically, emotionally. There are anti-war songs in North Vietnam now. There is still a shortage of rice in their bellies. Those people have been driven into combat for perhaps longer than anyone in modern times. I can tell you that having visited Hong Kong last year and looked into the refugee situation, the boat people situation, which is indeed a sad thing to contemplate and to examine, in the UN camps, I learned from our young representative with the State Department over in Hong Kong last year, that is 84, I was over there in 85. In 1984, 49% of the boat people reaching Hong Kong were from North Vietnam. A substantial portion of them were from the Vietnamese army. The stories those people have to tell about what is going on in their country are being unpublicized because they're sitting in camps in Hong Kong very much like concentration camps, some of them long enough to have 4- or 5-year-old children. And the UN, for some reason or another, is not making those people accessible to Western correspondents if the Western correspondents are interested. But there is a very interesting story going on which could be used in relevance to this to generate some resentment. I bring that up because we didn't sustain enough unity in a war with them in which 4 presidents said we would save the freedom of the people of South Vietnam, no matter what it took. We didn't sustain the unity to keep the leverage applied in spite of the sacrifice of almost 60,000 American servicemen dead, in spite of the sacrifice of many tens of millions of dollars per year in our budget against a tiny little country. Why? Because we didn't have the unity. We didn't maintain unity. We hated one another. We hated our country. We burned our flag. We despised our authorities. We did not respect them. I don't think they deserved all that disrespect, and I have as much to bring against some of the stupid things that were done during that war as I believe anyone does. But we lost that leverage, so we lost the war even after the military achieved a military victory. That war was won in the sense of militarily breaking their will. Why did we lose it? Because we didn't keep the unity, therefore we didn't keep the leverage, and therefore we lost the war politically after winning, we lost the peace after winning the war. So what I'm saying is that although I believe the President has followed an appropriate and effective policy, and I support him, I agree that also that, or acknowledge that there are limitations to the success of that policy. That policy can be improved, I agree, and our efforts improve. But I say the key to the improvement depends upon improving solidarity, bipartisanship, and embracing the legislative and executive branch. And I'm encouraged to see members of the House here this morning, as well as both parties engaged in dialogue with these people who have good cause to come before Congress. So if we're going to reachieve enough unity to cause them and leverage to get them to account for our prisoners, we're going to have to come from a place where we couldn't achieve sufficient unity and leverage to sustain the pressure required to achieve the victory which our military had won, to stop the enslavement of millions of more people besides the South Vietnamese. So how do you think we're going to get the leverage to get accountability for prisoners when they're going to lie through their teeth to you about it? We haven't got anything to bring to bear against them. That's all they listen to, leverage. How many divisions does the Pope have? So all I'm going to pray for, as a basic thing that does stand among us all, is that we have some sense of the desirability of achieving understanding with one another, developing knowledge, but while we try to do that, and arguing is one way to do that, and you have complaints that I fully understand, and I don't blame you for venting frustration, but let's remember this isn't a really crooked government in those terms. Can you really believe that President Reagan is not interested in bringing those men home? I don't. I think he was one of the most emotionally involved people about that and remains so. But he is relatively helpless. And one of the features of helplessness is the lack of unity, which will provide him the leverage to do the things required to get those people to account for our prisoners. So I ask you to realize that no matter how strongly you feel, our paths mutually must try to come together. And I pray that that's what will happen. That's the only way we're going to achieve success in this. My hopes and prayers and efforts remain with the families of the MIAs and with those who, their friends and so on. They deserve our best efforts. I say unity is the only way to achieve that. I have to respond, Mr. Chairman, in closing, to a mention made of my office the other day by Major Mark Smith, who said that he approached my office and that they more or less brushed him off, telling him to go to the National League of Families. My recollection of his letter was that it dealt with his problems in staying in the Army because of failure of being selected for promotion. He attributed some of his difficulties to reaction against his intelligence gathering activities, and I had no way to find out the validity of his charges. And if my sons, and I have had a son ask once that I help him with something or other in the service, I don't do that. In the Navy, they put a big PI, that means political influence there, and I'm not about to do that. I wasn't about to do it for him any more than I would from one of my sons. So I told him I just couldn't do that. But as far as saying I wouldn't cooperate with him about knowledge about the POWs, I never did that, and I want to get the record straight on that. Now, we do have thousands of people who approach me on this subject. I can't see them all for as much time as they want. But if you can get it together in some kind of a way that we can read it, united, carefully put together, I'll read it all. It's one of my greatest concerns. Again, Mr. Chairman, I have noted personally, not just professionally, your deep interest in this. I know your own tearings of direction. I know that you and Senator DeConcini, from what I've heard, have found areas of disagreement and so on. I don't deplore those because we can, if we remain good-willed, advance from scuffling in the achievement of understanding of knowledge and in the gathering of knowledge. But I hope we will try to keep the goodwill required to get unity, because that's the only way we're going to get leverage, that's the only way we're going to get accountability. And I'd not only like to see our guys come home that are alive, I'd not only see accountability, like to see accountability, but I would like to see a psychological pressure, at least, which will relieve the plight of other human beings who may not be of exactly our color or our nationality, but who are suffering, who are on the pipeline in the Soviet Union to slave labor, who are in re-education camps. They're human beings. If we're Christian, Jew, or Muslim, we ought to care about them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Denton. We very much appreciate your testimony, and your particular insight is a very valuable one from the standpoint of the examination of this record. I'm going to call on two of our House colleagues who have been with us intermittently as we have proceeded with the hearing, Representative Gilman from New York and Representative Solomon, also from New York. You may come up individually or share the witness table as you see fit. I would ask that you rise as other witnesses have. And do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please signify by stating I do. I do. Thank you. Gentlemen, I would ask that you proceed, and we welcome your testimony.
Thank you very much, Senator and Mr. Chairman. At the outset, let me just say that I feel like tearing up my testimony and just say I concur with every single thing that Senator Jeremiah Denton has just said. He said it all, and he said it the way it should be said, as far as bipartisanship. That's what we really need. And Senator, I just admire you greatly, have been in the past. I admire you for the statements you just made. But also like to say to you, Senator Murkowski, next year I will be the ranking Republican on the full Veterans Affairs Committee, and I've enjoyed working with you so much in the past, and next year, particularly on this issue, I'm going to look forward to pursuing it with every bit of vigor that we both have, and I greatly appreciate the fine job that you've done. I especially appreciate the invitation that you extended to House Veterans Affairs members, particularly to colleague Bob McKeon and Mike Bilirakis, who did accompany you on that trip. So again, I thank you for that. I'll try to be as brief as possible. As chairman of the House Task Force on American prisoners of war and missing in Southeast Asia, I've had the opportunity to closely follow the administration's strategy, Vietnamese responses, and U.S. domestic reactions. And in that capacity, Mr. Chairman, I would point out that the Task Force on POW/MIAs is an adjunct to the House Subcommittee on Asia Pacific, of which I serve along with Congressman Solars, who is the chairman of that subcommittee. Congressman Solars and I have just gone through a rather bitter hearing on the Philippines, of which he and I see eye to eye on nothing. But on this issue, I just wanted for the record to be stated that Congressman Solars has done an outstanding job in his committee on this POW/MIA issue. I want to commend him and also speak for him in a bipartisan matter here today. Mr. Chairman, our task force has held open and closed hearings. We've met with foreign officials. We've been briefed on sensitive negotiations after delegation meetings with the Vietnamese and with the Laos. We've met with those who allege conspiracy and cover-up, and we've conducted a year-long investigation into such charges. And this issue, charged as it is with great interest and emotion, brings with it some of the most unselfish and caring behavior that I've seen. It has also brought with it a minority that some of which prey on emotion for perhaps personal, for perhaps financial, or even political gain. And I emphasize the word minority because I believe it is important for all of us to recognize that those exploiting this issue are, in fact, a minority. Some certainly I don't think, know what they're doing. However, they are loud and they attempt to capture the media's attention with controversy and may, in fact, have a vested interest in seeing that current progress be stalled or muted. And I hate to say that, but I think maybe it needs to be said. Their irresponsible approach to this very serious issue has made simplistic proposals seem appealing at times, even to me. Most of their solutions assume that this is a domestic problem that we can solve here in the United States, instead of it being a foreign problem, as Senator Denton has so articulately pointed out. The answers, however, lie not in the United States. They lie in Hanoi, a distant and seemingly impenetrable nation. So action-oriented as we Americans are, appeals for special commissions, for investigations, and for private cross-border forays provide an avenue to vent our frustrations. And these options will not solve the problem, as they ignore Hanoi's role in the solution. Again, as Senator Denton has pointed out, if anything, they may even jeopardize progress that has been made, and there has been significant progress made. These approaches, as appealing as they are to some, will never match the well-developed strategy of the Reagan administration, which, by the way, is finally showing real results. From a dead start, I consider it a dead start in 1981, we have seen tough, tenacious, and until recently, very quiet negotiations pursued by the United States government. We have seen the Defense Intelligence Agency, POW/MIA operation, grow from almost a caretaker operation to a full-time special office, staffed by nearly 20 talented experts. We have seen similar growth in our joint casualty resolution centers in Hawaii and Asia. We have also seen the cooperation grow between the government and the National League of Families in the kind of spirit that only serious efforts can spawn. And I take my hat off to the National League of Families. They have been totally cooperative and really have given us that spirit that we need to accomplish what we have been able to do, the Senate and the House, over these past few years. Now, recently, we have seen agreements reached for joint crash site excavations in both Laos and Vietnam. We've seen the accelerated return of the remains of our missing and two-way dialogue on our highest priority, which is the live prisoner issue. And that's something that we have accomplished, and I think that's a great start. Finally, we've seen for the first time a public commitment by Vietnam to try to resolve the issue in 2 years. That's a tremendous accomplishment, and I credit you, Mr. Chairman, for having brought us that far. Now, those who charge conspiracy and cover-up in such an environment are not seeing or hearing the historical importance of things that are happening around us. Skeptics on the live POW issue ask, why would Hanoi hold them? Why would they hold our prisoners? And I think the real question is, why would the Reagan administration not want them returned? Why would a man like Ronald Reagan, one of the most patriotic individuals that this country has ever known, why in the world would he not want them returned? The answer is he does want them returned with every bit of strength that he has. I can think of fewer greater successes than the return of even one man who may still be held captive in Indochina. The idea of a cover-up is absurd on its face. An administration who wishes to cover this issue up would hardly take the actions we have seen to resolve this question. It is absurd from a practical standpoint. Can anyone believe that Vietnam veterans and returned POWs who today saturate the Defense Intelligence Agency, most of them are prisoners of war themselves, or they are Vietnam veterans? Why in the world would they pursue this issue for the government where they would allow a cover-up to happen? That is totally absurd. And I know every single one of those men. They are patriotic Americans. They are like all of us here today. They would not cover up an issue like this. That's a terrible thing to even suggest. It is also absurd from a substantive standpoint. I mentioned earlier our House Task Force investigation. These cover-up charges do not hold water. When we started, they do not hold water now. And I think it's time that those making such charges join this national quest to return our missing men to this country. I think national unity on a bipartisan basis, backing President Reagan's efforts, the first strong efforts we've had in years, I think that sends a powerful message to Hanoi. That's the message they want to hear. Divisive tactics, irresponsible charges, and simplistic solutions that make us appear impatient also send a powerful message, a message that the Vietnam people saw during the war. Let's don't send that message again. That was a terrible situation when we Americans did not stand together. Let's don't do that again. Those perpetrating such divisiveness, regardless of their intentions, and many of those intentions are good, and I've opened my office and I've talked to many of those people, must remember that the responsibility that let's cooperate. Finally, I hope the national media will begin to scrutinize closer the assertions made by some of those who have appointed themselves as the guardians of this issue. Ask them the hard questions, as this committee is doing, and as I am doing. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I would urge you to finish these hearings by listening closely to the official testimony that will follow this week on the charges that have been made. There is a story to be told, but it hasn't been told yet. Again, Mr. Chairman, I just want to take my hat off to you and to the committee and to my colleague, Ben Gilman, who serves as co-chairman of this task force, for the outstanding job that you've done. I really believe that we've made some progress, and I hope to God that we continue and that we bring home any living American that's over there now. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Representative Solomon. I think your testimony appropriately outlines the intent of the Senate committee in initiating these hearings, and I very much appreciate the in-depth analysis that went into your statement. I, too, look forward to working with you, sir, in the future. Representative Gilman, we await your statement. I think you gentlemen perhaps should exchange seats, because otherwise the microphones may not be able to pick up Representative Gilman's statement. Thank you very much. Please proceed, Representative Gilman from New York,
Thank you,
22nd District. We only have one district in our state, so I occasionally overlook the
And it's a large
significance of that.
Mr. Chairman, we thank you for the opportunity to appear today, and I want to thank the members of your mission that went with you to Hanoi to explore the issue further and to bring back to us a further optimistic message that we can move even further in the direction that we're all seeking, and that's a full and final accounting of our missing. Our committee has traveled to Hanoi on a number of occasions, and when I served on the Select Committee of the Missing in Action, we went. And in each one of those occasions in the past, we were lectured about our role in the conflict in Vietnam and in Laos. It's encouraging to hear in more recent days, instead of lectures, that you're receiving information and a more of a cooperative attitude than we've had in the past. And I want to associate myself with the remarks of our distinguished task force chairman, Mr. Solomon, who's led our committee over the past year as a part of the subcommittee on Asian and Pacific Affairs in our House Foreign Affairs Committee, where that responsibility has rested ever since the Select Committee on the Missing in Action went out of business in the late 70s, something that I criticized as being premature, but we were pleased that our House Foreign Affairs Committee picked up the gavel and went forward with this issue and has since addressed it continually since the late 70s. And I commend your committee for continuing in this effort in the Senate. And I certainly want to commend our colleague, Mr. McKeon, for his efforts on the Intelligence Committee in trying to address that matter in every possible avenue through our intelligence agencies. Additionally, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to take a moment of the committee's time to call your attention to the sterling bipartisan approach that's been mentioned not only by Senator Denton, but also by Mr. Solomon. We have a bipartisan committee, of course, in the House, and our chairman of our subcommittee on Asian Affairs, Mr. Solars, who's one of the leading members on the other side of the aisle, has performed his responsibility on this issue in a remarkable and outstanding manner and has continually pressed and pushed our task force to conduct further in-depth inquiries in every issue that comes before it. And I want to commend, too, the National League of the Families of Missing in Action, who've done such good work over the past years and have been an inspiration to all of us to continue in our efforts and have provided us with information. And I would like to urge all of those witnesses who've come before you and indicated they had additional information and wanted to go into executive session to provide that information, I would hope that any information they have or should come upon in the future, that they would not wait until there's a public hearing to divulge it, but to present it to us so that it can get into the hands of the proper agencies to make a full and thorough investigation so that we can help resolve this very painful and troublesome issue. And the Senate can rest assured that the House will not rest on this issue as long as our present chairman are fully responsible for conducting this investigation. I've been continually involved with the issue since first coming to the Congress in 1972, at which time our American involvement with the Southeast Asian conflict had not yet ended. Over the years, our greatest obstacle, of course, has been apathy. The apathy of Americans and of past administrations that sought to put our involvement in Vietnam behind us, and the apathy of new generations that do not have a proper awareness of the MIA POW issue. In the past year or two, we've been confronted with a new obstacle, that of oversimplification. Some of our citizenry, who upon the most part are well-meaning and patriotic, do not have a full appreciation of the complexity of this highly important and sensitive issue. Fanned by the sensational Rambo creations of Hollywood, too many are convinced that most of our missing, who may be alive and being held captive against their will, that all that's necessary to rescue them is a small team armed with adequate firepower. Unfortunately, too many Americans do not draw the line between Hollywood fantasy and the stark reality of the complexity of this kind of an issue. Mr. Chairman, for the first time since the close of the Southeast Asian conflict, we have an administration that's giving this issue the high priority status that it fully deserves. During the past year, more progress has been made toward resolving this issue than at any time since the Vietnamese conflict. In February 1985, an American Lao technical team was allowed to excavate the Pak Se crash site in Laos. That resulted in a repatriation of some 13 sets of American remains, the first excavation of its type. In addition, a survey has been undertaken at the next site, which will soon be jointly excavated. The Laotian negotiations, which are bearing increasing fruit, have resulted in pledges from the Lao government for multiple excavations and unilateral recovery efforts. In the January 20th, 1986 issue of Newsweek, there was a good summary of subsequent developments in Vietnam, and I quote, "Last July, Foreign Minister Tak of Vietnam set a 2-year timetable for settling this issue. Since then, Hanoi has repatriated more than 30 sets of remains and have staged a joint excavation with the United States. Last week, it said it would hand over information on 50 more MIAs in February. In turn, Washington promised more details about United States crash sites. Both sides agreed to make the number of technical meetings previously set at 6 per year open-ended. The Vietnamese also vowed to keep looking into reports of live Americans, something they agreed to last year. The next technical meeting between American and Vietnamese representatives is, as you know, Mr. Chairman, scheduled to take place at the end of February. And at that time, we anticipate receiving reports from the Vietnamese on the 50 additional cases of missing Americans that they talked about. In their desire to improve relations with our own nation, and in keeping with their self-imposed deadline of early 1988 for a resolution of this issue, the Vietnamese are now cooperating in response to the hard, insistent line that our administration has taken on this issue. Our POW MIA technical team has reported recently that although Hanoi still reiterates their denial of the existence of Americans in their nation, they're now willing to investigate any reported sightings which we call to their attention. And that certainly is a significant change in their policy and a major step in accelerating the dialogue in accounting for any prisoners. In the past, I recall turning over hundreds of files in the Vietnamese language, in the Laotian language, and not getting any response at all from either one of those governments. And today we're getting an indication of a cooperative effort. Mr. Chairman, over the past 14 years in our work on the former House Select Committee on the Missing, as well as on our work in the House Task Force, we've met with countless families of the POWs and MIAs. We've met with former prisoners. We met with families who do not know the fates of their loved ones. We took up the issue with communist officials throughout Indochina, who so often in the past responded, as you know, in a cold and heartless manner. We also had to deal with the officials of prior administrations who sometimes lost sight of the goal of accountability in their endeavor to sweep the issue under the rug. I believe, Mr. Chairman, that our House POW Task Force and your committee speaks out for a majority of our colleagues in both the House and Senate when we state that we do not intend to give up our quest for an accounting until we receive conclusive proof that there are no Americans left alive. And we don't intend to cease our efforts until we have the fullest possible accounting for the more than 2,400 American heroes still either prisoner or missing and unaccounted for in Southeast Asia. However, those of us in the Congress who are concerned with the issue must recognize that the Hollywood Rambo initiatives are fantasies, and that the ultimate resolution of this issue must come about by way of government-to-government negotiations and not through any private mercenary initiatives. It's incumbent upon us at this very sensitive time, when we're beginning to open a door in our negotiations, to let Hanoi know that we stand firmly behind our administration in its determined stance at the negotiating table. While Rambo may be a pleasant way to spend a rainy afternoon, the POW MIA issue is far too important to the families of the missing, to our nation, to be relegated to fiction and to fantasy. And I commend Senator Denton for his call for national unity. Mr. Chairman, I submit that the time has come not to ask the President to get behind us, but for us to get behind our President and our administration in seeking a full and final accounting. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Representative Gilman. I would like to compliment both you and Representative Solomon. I think that you have given the American people reassurance that their responsible elected officials have, through diligence and perseverance, examined to the very best of their ability the issue and are proceeding in a responsible manner to resolve this. I couldn't help but reflect on your comments, which certainly reinforced the position that our particular congressional delegation, which was a bipartisan delegation, representative of both the House and Senate members, went in with. We went in with the commitment of our administration that we assume there are living Americans in Southeast Asia being held in an unknown capacity until we have evidence to indicate otherwise. When we came back, I think it fair, and Representative McKeon is certainly free to elaborate, but I think it's fair that we felt progress had been made in the governments of both Vietnam and Laos indicating cooperation on the issue of remains, the fact that we would be allowed to have a presence over there in the excavation, that the 2-year work program was going to proceed, that the February meeting would be held, and Foreign Minister Tak personally advised us that he had not, up until that time, accepted nor given notice to our government through Secretary Armitage that the meeting was on. He, in effect, said, "You can tell him the meeting is on," and gave us encouragement that an unknown number of remains would be turned over at that time. It was very difficult to get any specific accounting. The indications were that there were 50 instances that had been communicated around the countryside, but obviously the information system in Vietnam is not one that's very reliable, but it was certainly an encouragement with regard to the progress that was being made. The same thing was true in Laos, where we were advised that now that the dry season had begun, that there were 2 sites and they would proceed with a program for excavation. One has to question the motivation of what those governments want, why they're cooperating, but I think rather than lament on motivation, we should move as rapidly as possible with dispatch and get those remains as rapidly as possible, because we all suspect what their ultimate motivation might be. I also sensed when we were given an opportunity to talk to the media, the feeling, which we certainly shared as well, of disappointment in as much as we did not get any general encouragement on the issue of live sightings. Now that, I'm speaking my own analysis, was an honest assessment, and as a consequence I felt compelled to communicate that to the American people through the media. I can understand that there was a bit of a reaction that I sensed, that isn't what people wanted to hear. And I went over there, and I think my colleagues went over there, wanting to hear something positive, that we could report to the American people on live sightings. And naturally, when you're subjected to the litany of a government and government representatives, why, you take that with an appropriate grain of salt. On the other hand, the British ambassador, as I indicated in my opening testimony, had been kind enough to set up a private breakfast for us in Hanoi. And during that time, we had an opportunity to converse with ambassadors from France, from the Netherlands, from Germany, Italy, as well. There were 6 of them there. And we had a very open discussion trying to get some encouragement. They indicated that they had access throughout the countryside. They did not dismiss the possibility that there were Americans being held, but they had nothing encouraging to communicate to us, and we were there to try and find something encouraging. And I think that, again, that's something the American people should hear. Not that we take issue with our belief that there are living Americans, simply the reality that we didn't receive anything substantive. And I am suspicious, as my colleague, for the rationale of why they won't allow an independent organization such as the UN or the Red Cross to come in and do the monitoring. What they did say, and we heard it at least on 2 occasions during the enunciation from the foreign minister talk, that if you don't believe me, I'll take you out. And he pointed to Representative McKeon and Bilirakis and Deacon Seeley. He said, I will show you that there's nobody here. Well, you can take that with a grain of salt, too. But he went out of his way to make that statement. These things are neither here nor there. They're just a reporting of what we saw and what we heard. And I think we continue to ask, well, if they won't let independent agencies in, they must be hiding something, and I think that's a most appropriate conclusion. But the facts are, we should concentrate, as you've pointed out so explicitly, on where the progress is being made. Expedite those remains, continue to push for whatever possible resolve we can make on the live sightings. And of course, that's the purpose of these hearings, to get that information, to address it with the administration, to pursue on a government-to-government relationship a follow-up. They have indicated to us, and we take this with a grain of salt, that if there is evidence, submit it to them. They have indicated they would follow up to members of our committee, as well as through our government. So that's where we are currently, and they indicated as far as illegal entries into their country, and they had some information, and I have no idea whether it's official or through our government, that 4 Americans had entered their country, Vietnam, illegally. They had combed and communicated throughout the countryside. They had no knowledge that they were in the country, but they were alerted for them, and if they were caught, they would be apprehended. Obviously, we don't encourage American citizens to do illegal acts, but we have no control over them when they leave our country. So these are the facts for the American people to evaluate, judge, and I think look forward to the administration's response to very legitimate questions that have been brought up during this hearing process and will continue to be brought up. But I very much appreciate your testimony, gentlemen. I think it's right on target of what we're attempting to accomplish collectively, bipartisan, and that is a resolve for the benefit of all Americans, and particularly those families. And I'll never forget the day I was at Arlington Cemetery at the memorial last year put on by the children of the MIAs. And one young woman, she wasn't a girl anymore, she was a young woman, came to me and said she'd been coming to that ceremony for 7 years, and she didn't want to come back next year. She wanted a resolve, one way or another. And I think that's what we're attempting to do, and I commend you, and I'm sorry to have taken so much time. Representative McKeon.
Chairman, I applaud your statement and join in the accolades that you've extended towards my colleagues and express my deep personal appreciation for your commitment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I just would once again want to commend you and your delegation, and including Mr. McKeon, for undertaking this very important recent mission and then holding hearings so quickly upon your return and reporting to the American public your analysis and your comments, your appraisal of the recent efforts. I think that that's extremely helpful to what we're all seeking to do. And to those who have information of one sort or another, I hope that they would not withhold that for executive sessions or public hearings, but would relay it to your committee and to our House Task Force Committee so that we can put it in the appropriate hands for an investigation. After all, that's what evidence is utilized for, to pursue the issue. And by sitting on it and withholding it, it doesn't do anyone any good. Thanks again, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Joe. Our next witness, and that's number 13 on a list of 17, plus those that we will go back to this afternoon in a closed session for security reasons, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Howard, U.S. Army, Stuttgart, West Germany. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please signify by saying aye. We welcome you to the committee. and look forward to your testimony, and I would ask that you be seated, and you may proceed at your discretion. We are very pleased that you could be with us. We understand that you came over especially from Germany for this hearing.
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Howard, 30 years active duty, United States Army, served almost 5 years in Southeast Asia, participated in almost 300 battles against the enemy, received 52 declarations of valor, and I appear before this committee today at the committee's request.
Well, I would ask you, sir, do you care to, based on the testimony that you have heard in your own personal experience, recognizing that the topic of this hearing is the issue of live sightings, care to make a general statement with regard to your observations and attitudes on the matter?
Mr. Chairman, I am convinced that we have live Americans in captivity in Southeast Asia.
And are you convinced that they're being held against their will?
Some are being held against their will.
Can you give us any indication that you have with reference to evidence to that effect? Why do you feel that that's the case?
Sir, I would be happy to answer that question, but I feel that I have to answer that in closed session.
In your area of experience, in your official capacity, what association did you have with the alleged living Americans? Have you had communications? Have you, during your professional career in the military, had occasion to either have photographs, communication, or otherwise with them in Southeast Asia?
Information, photographs pertaining to the subject is questioned, sir.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the answer.
Information, intelligence information, photographs.
Can you give us any explanation as to why we have not been more successful in our efforts, if indeed there are living Americans being held against their will, to get a release of those Americans that you contend are being held in Vietnam or Laos?
Sir, I would have to state my personal opinion on that. I only feel that because of the compartmented system that we have, that the information is not passed up appropriately through our chain of command to those people that lead our country, that can make the proper decision to gain that release that you have just stated.
Recognizing the general testimony that's been given, where I think without exception all witnesses have generally, and I think this is a fair statement, concluded that those people that are in responsible positions, particularly in the joint casualty identification area, where I have had the opportunity to visit, as well as my colleagues, there's some very dedicated people in that area, veterans. We've heard from our former witnesses with regard to their assessment of the very dedicated people that are involved in the entire chain. What could possibly be the motivation for anything less than a very candid and open and aggressive effort to resolve this issue? In other words, my question, I guess, is what is your assessment of motivation that would possibly lead to anything but fullest disclosure?
Mr. Chairman, I would have to answer that question in closed session.
Even on a personal opinion?
Even on personal opinion, because I would not state personal opinion, I would state factual information.
Do you have information yourself relative to live sightings or information that would lend to the credence of live sightings?
Mr. Chairman, I have been exposed to information. I have none in my possession at this time, and I have not had any information in my possession in the last 19 months. However, prior to that time, I was exposed to that information.
May I ask, sir, what you did with that information?
The information, sir, was passed to the appropriate agencies responsible for deciphering that information.
What agency was that, sir?
Military intelligence, sir, and DIA, sir.
And that was where? In Washington, in
No,
Hawaii, in Bangkok?
Mr. Chairman, this information was provided in Korea to the appropriate agencies mentioned
19 months ago in Korea?
prior to that time, sir. Prior to that time.
So I'm a little confused. Now, you indicated 19 months ago. You haven't had any information for 19 months, and what happened 19 months ago?
Mr. Chairman, 19 months ago, I was transferred from my last duty assignment, which was located in Korea, to Europe, where I'm stationed now.
All right, to go back, I have to draw the conclusion that you may have had information prior to 19 months ago, which you
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged, I believe.
Yes, sir.
And you were in Korea then, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And the information you had, you made available in Korea to the appropriate defense intelligence agency, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And do you have any idea what was done with that information?
No, I do not, sir.
And you're not at liberty to tell this committee in open session what that information is?
No, sir.
Is there a reason for that?
Yes, sir.
What is the reason?
The classification of the information, sir.
Can you tell us how you came about this information?
Mr. Chairman, it was my duty to come about that information, to provide that information to those agencies that were
How did you
responsible.
get the information?
Through intelligence sources, sir.
Were you associated with an intelligence source in Korea?
Yes, sir.
What intelligence source?
Special Forces Detachment Korea, sir.
And that was an intelligence responsibility. Can you tell us how or from whom you received this intelligence in Korea?
Mr. Chairman, the mission of the Special Forces Detachment that was stationed in Korea, which was assigned to me, I was chief of the Combat Support Coordination Team, was responsible for gathering that information. I, again, will provide you that information in closed session because of the classification of the information.
Can you tell us, for the record, what techniques are used by those forces to gather information? Surely that is...
Mr. Chairman, sir, I will be happy to answer that question in closed
I
session.
wouldn't have assumed that that would be classified, but you're certainly free to hold whatever information you feel is sensitive, and I respect that. I would defer to my colleague, and I'm going to return to some questioning. Representative McKeon?
My only observation would be, Colonel Howard, do you have something you'd like to say to us that, rather than us asking particular questions, that this is obviously an issue that you have very deep commitment?
Yes, I do, sir. I have a very deep commitment to it. I have since 1965. I would like to say to this committee that the information that has been presented here by Major Mark Smith, retired, and Sergeant First Class McIntyre is honest, truthful information. And I appear here today to confirm that statement.
I appreciate your doing that very, very much. And I look forward to your testimony in closed session. And let me just say as a preface to that, that Senator Murkowski and I serve jointly on the Select Committees on Intelligence and on the Veterans Affairs Committee. And I hope that in preparation for your testimony in closed session, that due to the limited time that we'll be together, that you will share with us anything and everything that you feel that we could do in the unique positions that we hold presently to resolve this issue in the manner that you as a soldier know that it should be resolved.
I will do that, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Might I ask you, sir, if the Army encouraged your testimony or discouraged it or had any opinion whatsoever and how was it initiated that you indicated an interest in testifying?
Mr. Chairman, sir, I volunteered my testimony in support of Major Mark Smith and Sergeant First Class McIntyre.
And what about the attitude of the Army or your superiors? Was there any expression?
Mr. Chairman, sir, as long as you're honest, the Army will accept that testimony. As long as you tell the truth, there's nothing wrong with it.
So in other words, there was no discouragement, no encouragement. You were just free to testify as any American would be.
Yes, sir.
Please, yes.
Along with that line, in your 30 years' experience in the Army, is it conceivable that a major general could discourage a subordinate from taking a particular course of action, as was the testimony?
Yes, sir, that's conceivable.
Thank you.
It's absolutely conceivable.
The question of the believability of their testimony on that particular issue was raised earlier, Mr. Chairman. That's why I wish to get the Colonel's opinion on it. Thank you.
In your testimony, do you intend that will be classified to have available areas where you believe positively that Americans are being held against their will in Southeast Asia?
Mr. Chairman, sir, I cannot positively identify those areas now because I have not been privileged to that information for the period of time that I've stated to you. However, at one time, I did have that information available to me, and I could have pointed out to you on a map, but I cannot positively do that now.
In one of the affidavits that's not classified, there was a conclusion that I believe could be construed as your statement that there was little interest on the part of your military superiors when you briefed them on the information that you had received. And that was a briefing in Thailand.
That's true, sir.
Can you give us any reason why you believe your military superiors would not have an interest in that information?
Again, Mr. Chairman, I will discuss that in closed session. I will be very happy to answer that question.
Well, sir, I guess we're down to a situation where any further testimony,
One final question.
please.
Colonel Howard, do you have a successor in your position in Korea that would have access to the knowledge that you had 19 months prior?
Yes, sir.
Do you feel that we can pursue the same avenues, chain of command and intelligence sources that you had access to and arrive at the same conclusions that you held a couple of years ago?
You should be able to, sir, but I have been told it's only hearsay evidence. That evidence is not available now because some of the evidence has been destroyed.
All right. I thank you very much.
What you have alluded to, and I use that word very loosely because of the realization that we're approaching a classified area. But obviously, we look forward to your testimony in a classified context. It could potentially lead, if there is enough evidence, to initiate a communication specifically to either the Vietnamese or the government in Laos. It could further lead, if my colleagues individually or collectively, those of us who made the mission, and indeed your information funnels into and is applicable to Vietnam, the initiation of a request through the Foreign Minister Tak, who volunteered to lead, as I think the word was, any one of us to a specific location. So I would simply relate, Colonel, that we look forward to receiving a substantive testimony that will hopefully would identify your contention and lead us to a resolve of whatever information or allegations you have evidence of. Mr. McKeon, do you have anything further for the witness? Thank you very much, Colonel. We will get to your closed testimony within the afternoon. I intend to go through the witness list as we are doing. I think we're on number 14, and I'm getting too much paperwork here. We will go to 17. We will take a half-hour break, and then we will come back in a closed session for the benefit of those of you who are your excuse, Colonel, and I appreciate very much your testimony and your willingness to come from West Germany on this very worthwhile cause and give us your statement. I want to also advise those of you who are waiting for the administration witness list that the hearing has been moved from Tuesday to Monday, and we will reconvene in the final session of the hearing. It'll be a public session Monday morning at 10 a.m. And we will, of course, at that session have the administration witnesses, and we anticipate, I'm told, moving it yet a third time for reasons unknown to me, and it will be in the Russell building next door, Senate Russell 414, which is our Veterans Affairs Committee hearing room, which is the smallest of the three rooms that you would have experienced, and it's a cooler room and the window's open. And the fireplace works, not that that's a concern. I wonder, Mr. McKeon, if you could open the next witness while I be excused. I must make a phone call. Mr. Michael Van Atta, editor of The Insider. And would you swear the gentleman in?
Fine. Thank you. Fine.
Excuse me, there, Aaron Smith is supposed to testify for me.
Bobby Lee is the chairman's position because he got all the rest there.
I was just told in addition, so you please proceed if you would, and I'll be back in about 10 minutes. I think you better come over by the microphone and bring your sign so that they'll know you're not Murkowski. You look too Irish to be Murkowski.
He has a question on Terrence Smith. Does that have anything to do with it?
He will not be testifying.
Mr. Van Atta, as I understand it, you're the next witness. Are you prepared to testify?
Yes, sir.
Fine. Will you write? You solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and if so, please signify by stating I do.
I do.
You may be seated. You may proceed with your testimony either in summary or by presentation.
5 minutes is a tough time, and I'm going to do the best I can, okay? I'd like to point out that I am a Vietnam veteran. The background on me is that I publish a newsletter called The Insider. It was started in January of '82. It's dedicated to proving that there are live POWs and informing the American public of that fact. Okay? There are some reasons why I'm here, and that is because there were Americans that were captured that were not released. And I'm holding up a photograph of an American this is a point of capture. The Vietnamese, apparently, or Laotians, are surrounding him, and it's a point of capture photograph. I believe this is in the files of the Defense Intelligence Agency. It's been provided to them. I would hope that you'd realize that there's a problem with the Americans that were left behind, that were captured, that we did not account for. And I hope to go through 4 lists with you of people who were probably in the captivity of the Vietnamese and the Laotians. In 1981, a friend of mine, George Brooks, gave me this document. This document shows that there were 351 first-hand live sightings as of August of 1981, 22 of those attributable to Laos. Okay? The administration would have you believe that there are 95 unresolved reports. On those unresolved reports, there's 13 that are attributable to Laos. Since August of '81, we've received 447 first-hand live sightings. That was as of October of '85. Those were figures given to me by the Defense Department. Okay. Let me start with this list. What I've done is I took the Defense Department list of people that were missing in Southeast Asia, and off of that list I took the people that were placed in Category 1. It was a military designation at the point that they were lost. What happened to them? Were they in the captivity of the enemy, or were those people lost in a situation where the enemy may have known where they were? I'd like to go down a couple of the people that are on this list and describe those to you so you could see what that information.
Mr. Bennett, is this in addition to the testimony you submitted? Or is it the testimony you did submit?
I'm going to go down that list of testimony.
Let me just say for your benefit, I've read your testimony.
Okay.
And therefore, if you're going to repeat that, you can, it is submitted into the record and it is there, and for your own benefit, you may wish to delete some of that and share any additional information you may like for us to hear and like to have added to the record.
Okay, I understand. On this list, let's take a look at number 7, it's Walter Moon. Walter Moon was lost April of '61 in Laos, and it indicates that he died in captivity July 22nd of '61 in an escape attempt, and it gives the grid location where he was lost. Okay? The location where he was lost in this map in Laos, here's Vientiane, and here's where he was lost. Okay? The Department of Defense would have you believe that there were 22 first-hand live sightings attributable to Laos in '81, and now they're saying there's only 13 that are unresolved. These are the live sightings that occurred inside of that circle, that grid, where he was lost. There are 34 sightings of Americans in that grid. I think that the data holds true that it correlates there was somebody in there, not just one person, maybe several people. If you looked in the file of Walter Moon, you'd find that there supposedly are 2 eyewitnesses to his death. To move along, on this list, I'd like to take a look at number 22. It's D. Herdlicka. He was lost 5 of 65, but in July of '66, his picture appeared in Pravda. Number 45, E. Riley. He was lost 4 of 66. We found his ID card, and we found his interrogation papers. In other words, he was alive in captivity. I have an undebriefed source, which I've scheduled to meet with DIA, that gave me information on number 54, Mr. B. Small, who was lost 3 of 67, and he had a leg wound, and he was captured. My source was asked by a guard if he knew Mr. B. Small. Number 66, E. Weatherman. He was lost 11 of 67. He was reported died in captivity 5 of 68. My source saw him alive in 1976.
He's still listed as having died in captivity?
We still have him listed as died in captivity. DIA records will reflect that they also believe that he was alive in captivity after the time that the records which they have generated show that he died in captivity. Number 88 on this list, J. Ray, that's James Ray, lost 3 of 68. He's an MIA. My source was told that he was alive in June of 70. He's an interesting case. I've studied that extensively with the family. In his records, he died 6 of 69, but he was awarded an award for escaping July of 69. Several of the people that we interviewed who gave statements that he died in captivity have given us affidavits that say he did not die in captivity, and they did not say that. We caught up with the last one. Everything seemed to be hearsay, hinging on this one man. And he caught up with me 2 weeks ago, and he indicated that when he saw him, he was alive. It was late 1969.
Mr. Van Landen, what are your conclusions from this?
Well, my conclusions are that there's a lot of data that is available by just taking a look at the Defense Department's records and interviewing the family members, and that proves that there's some people that are alive. And I think that I know that I could go on and forever here, but what I've done is I've videotaped my presentation to you, and I'll make that submittal for the record.
I thank you very much.
Okay.
I truly appreciate that. Naturally, any testimony that's given is going to be subject to scrutiny, and so let me respond to some questions. Let you respond to some questions that might be presented after your absence. Is it your opinion that American service personnel are being held captive today by either the government of Laos or the government of Vietnam? Your testimony states that you have evidence that there were discrepancies as to American conclusions. Do those discrepancies continue today?
Yes, sir, they do.
Are you aware that documents such as the ones that you've referred to have been released since 1978, and that they've been subject to public scrutiny for years?
Yes, sir.
And that therefore it is understood one need not form direct conclusions from that data in and of itself, right?
Well, it's not in and of itself. That's why I was going through these different items.
So when corroborated with the personal information that you've received in your efforts, that you are informing the committee that they need to not rely strictly on the government reports, because they are obviously erroneous in a myriad of instances and should be acknowledged as such.
In some instances, which I've documented, yes.
Thank you very much. Any additional information you'd like to? I don't want to cut you off at all.
Okay, well, if I can go a little further, there is a gentleman who is on this list by the name of McKinley Nolan, and he was last seen in November '73. Here are 2 documents from the Defense Intelligence Agency, or Department of Defense, which mention him, that are dated May and June of 1970. Like I said, I'm going to submit a copy of the tape where I present all of these documents. I may point out to the public that I feel that there's substantial evidence here that proves they're alive Americans. Trying to go back and verify some of the items that DI said existed in the file, they don't exist.
I appreciate that very much. I appreciate your commitment to this issue and your willingness to testify today, and specifically to present this information. And then I'm sure that you'll be willing to respond to any additional questions the committee might have in following up the
the discrepancies you've identified.
Okay.
Is that fine? Thank you very much, Mr. Bennett. Who's next?
Tom Birch is sick, so this William Bennett is going to substitute. We're going to let him give the testimony, but when he has
All right.
questions.
Secretary of Education, William T. Bennett. Is Mr. Bennett,
He's going to substitute for Tom Birch.
is it necessary for me
He
to
needs to
swear him
be
in,
sworn.
I presume? Mr. Bennett, I understand you're to testify on behalf of Mr. Birch to present his testimony?
Mr. Birch is ill today, and as the coalition secretary, I'm here to fill in for him. if I
Thank
could.
you.
Thank you.
Good. You will join me in rising and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? And if so, please signify by stating I do.
I do.
Thank you. You may be seated.
I thank the committee, first of all, for allowing the activists to finally come in and present their case before Congress. We are, as the National Vietnam Veterans Coalition, we include among our members 27 organizations, including 3 of the 4 largest Vietnam veteran membership groups and most of the major POW organizations in the country. Although we're pleased to be here, we do have some concern in that the deadline for submitting testimony was fairly short, and there are several people who were not able to get their testimony in time to testify. And we're particularly concerned for one Tom Ashworth was not able to come in as a witness. And we would urge the committee to rescind that rule and permit him to come in because he has quite a bit of valuable data. And at this time, we'd like to request that his affidavit be submitted for the record with our testimony. Also believe that Mrs. Leitian, who provides some very valuable information, should be invited to testify. And then, in a limited time, to summarize the testimony we have already submitted for ourselves. We have no question but that among the Vietnam veterans movement, the live prisoner of war issue is the issue of greatest concern to the greatest number of Vietnam veterans. It's the comrades in arms, the men, of those who fought alongside the men who are missing. We Vietnam veterans have a legitimate interest in the subject at hand, interest which should be acknowledged by government officials. We feel it has been a mistake to regard this issue as one of exclusive concern to families, and primarily because they just do not have the numerical clout to make sure that the thing gets forced through. We think it'd be useful to remind America that perhaps half of all the prisoners of war being held did not return and were abandoned by the government, and we say the presumption should be that the men are still alive until proven otherwise, rather than the presumption being reversed in the opposite direction, and the fact that there is ostensibly no usable proof that the men are there seems to us to point out the significant deficiency in the intelligence process. And some of what we'd identify as deficiencies is refugee interrogation procedures. There's a widespread perception in the Indo-Chinese refugee community that U.S. authorities are not genuinely interested in the live POW intelligence, and the principal reason for this perception is the insensitivity and degrading harassment to which they are all too frequently subjected by DI personnel. We, of course, in the evaluation have this, as General Tigers called, the mindset to debunk, and if you review declassified refugee reports, we're struck by how often the analysis devoted to try to discredit the sighting rather than to try to work with it and assume it was good. Since we prepared this statement, it's come to our attention there has been controversy over fingerprints and photos, and we have learned that there is an FBI agent named Barry Monks who is the custodian of these records, and we suggest that the committee call him as a witness to get to the bottom of this controversy. We believe there is a pressing need for substantial rotation of personnel in the DIA and Joint Center, and that new personnel with fresh perspectives are needed to administer the program. Turning to policy for a moment, we believe that there's a very unfortunate tendency to have this whole issue divided into 2 categories. And you either support this policy, which is, as a practical matter means returning remains, or you have to engage in a private cross-border foray. We submit there is a middle ground on this. There are other options, such as the quotation, bribery to black helicopters in the night could be pursued aggressively. Resistance movements in Indochina could be supported as a pressure tactic on the Indo-Chinese governments. Assertive diplomacy obviously is an option, but when we have the people conducting these negotiations saying they don't have the usable proof, we can't see how they have the confidence in their own negotiating position to be effective at it. And then have also been asked that they've been approached by several directors of the National League of Families who said they were never even informed of this hearing taking place, and they would like the option to come and address that question. And further, obviously, as this committee gets into this deeper and deeper, you will see that the oversight capability is probably beyond your capacity because you are all spread thin on the Hill. No discredit to anybody up here, but you have many responsibilities, and what is really needed is an independent commission to really take charge of this thing and see it through. All right.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bennett. I appreciate your coming. I understand the difficult circumstances whereby Mr. Birch unable to be here during the time frame available. I appreciate your commitment, your willingness to understand, and the committee will submit further questions to Mr. Birch for further response if he so desires.
Thank you, sir.
With that, thank you very much. I can go 2 minutes, but
He's just finishing up in the hall, so if you
fine.
stand by, you can go.
Why don't you swear?
Yeah,
And let her start.
because she's just going to read it, isn't she? Joan Carlson, please. Go ahead, Joan. Joan, I understand you're going to present the testimony from Red McDaniel, and I understand that we have about 6 minutes left in the House to vote, and so since your testimony has been submitted, and I'm aware of it, we're going to ask that you enter it into the record, and so in so doing, if you would stand and raise your right hand and repeat after or respond. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please signify by saying I do.
I do.
Thank you. You may be seated and proceed with the testimony of Mr. McDaniel.
First of all, I'd like to preface my testimony. My introductory remarks make reference to the chairman and members of the committee, and I guess that is all one and the same at the present time. So,
Council will remain in our absence. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, on behalf of Red McDaniel and myself, Joan Carlson, I thank you for allowing me to provide testimony we are confident will assist you in pursuing the question of whether or not Americans are currently being held captive against their will in Southeast Asia. I also wish to personally thank you, Mr. Chairman, for establishing this open hearing, as it is the first such hearing since 1974. This fact in itself is consistent with the leadership taken by President Reagan's guidance in making the issue concerning POWs and MIAs in Southeast Asia a top priority of this administration. Before I read Red McDaniel's statement, I believe that it is essential to briefly explain my own background on the issue, for my involvement goes back to 1967, when my brother-in-law, Captain Stephen P. Hansen, was shot down in Laos. Most of you will recall this first POW bumper sticker, which reads, "POWs, MIAs, don't let them be forgotten." This effort was initiated by my sister, Carol Hansen, of El Toro, California. Too long, the plight of the POWs and MIAs had gone on virtually unnoticed by the American public and apparently of low priority to our own government. This bumper sticker campaign was just the beginning of many combined efforts that would bring this vital issue to the forefront and ultimately bring about some most positive results in improved treatment for our men in captivity, and finally, in 1973, the long-awaited release of those men held in Hanoi. You should also recall that Carol was instrumental in the formation of the National League of Families, and also, as was I, the establishment of POW MIA International, which work closely with the families and other concerned citizens and organizations to to distribute POW MIA bracelets, bumper stickers, and other materials to get the issue off the back pages of the newspapers and out into public view, thereby forcing some action to be taken to bring about improved conditions while in captivity and the ultimate release of our POWs. I also remember the occasion when we were in the office of the Governor of California. At the time, he was presented a POW bracelet which bore the name of my brother-in-law, Stephen P. Hansen. The former governor often retells one moment in particular that day while the POW MIA families were gathered around his office. After personally taking one small boy in the group to the governor's private bathroom, he felt a tug on his coattail, and looking down at the boy, the governor recalls him asking, "Would you please help bring my daddy home?" That small boy is now a midshipman, 3rd class, at the United States Naval Academy, Todd Hansen Hickerson. And of course, that governor of California is now President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. Therefore, from the late 60s to the present time, we, along with the majority of families of POWs and MIAs, have never conducted ourselves in a manner that would either embarrass our president and country or endanger the lives of Americans held captive. That is precisely why I am now working with Red McDaniel. After Operation Homecoming in 1973, I and members of my family knew that no Americans were released from the country of Laos. We knew that the big release was agreed upon between the United States and North Vietnam. The communist forces in Laos and Cambodia were not included. Therefore, if an American had the double misfortune of being captured by Pathet Lao troops or others, and not North Vietnamese, then he was excluded from the big release. Personally, we were fortunate for a crewman from Steve's helicopter who had been held in North Vietnam under an assumed name was released in 1973. He stated that prior to his evacuating the helicopter, he was witness to the fact that the pilot and co-pilot had mortally been wounded. Our frustration was, however, due to the fact we believed other Americans were still being held captive, how could we effectively keep the issue alive, knowing very well that after the big release in 1973 and our troop withdrawal immediately thereafter, America would want to put the issue of Vietnam far behind. With the focus turning to Watergate and our domestic needs, the possibility of live POWs still being held in Vietnam became an issue of little importance to our government and most Americans. Our problem was then how to be most effective. It was not until this past year, with the possibility of the POW MIA Commission being established, that our hopes were renewed. We also knew that, as before, the issue would never be resolved until the American public insisted that our government pursue every possible avenue to obtain the release of any live POWs. Prior to 1973, if the issue had remained solely a concern of wives and families, it would never have moved from obscurity to the front pages of newspapers around the world. It was only when individuals from all walks of life, individuals who never knew a POW, when teachers, the clergy, housewives, college students, and other concerned Americans made this a priority, yes, when this outcry of public support and interest included members of Congress, only then did anything of significance occur. This is why such action is so crucial today. And again, I thank this committee for holding these hearings. It was because of this need to allow an avenue for all concerned Americans to become involved in the issue that my husband and I, plus others, founded the organization POW MIA International Incorporated back in the early 70s. This organization allowed individuals who were not family members to participate. Primarily, we worked along with the National League of Families in 11 Western states. Senator Boschwitz, who is not now present, will recall our efforts in Minnesota as we had a Midwest office in St. Cloud while my husband Gary attended graduate school. When I first met Red McDaniel, I was pleased with his patriotism and overwhelming support of America. I was also pleased that he was willing to step out and again serve his country when he ran for U.S. Congress, and also with his efforts on behalf of the American Defense Institute. Red is as solid an American as you can find. That is why I was thoroughly pleased when he asked me to work with him on the POW MIA issue, and in particular, to get the POW MIA Commission established, so we could determine whether or not live American POWs were still being held in Southeast Asia, and if so, to bring them home, not in years, but in months. I would now like the committee to hear Red McDaniel's sworn statements concerning this most vital issue of live POWs still being held against their will in Southeast Asia. And I quote, "I am currently a citizen and resident of Alexandria, Virginia. I am employed with the American Defense Foundation in Washington, D.C. I am retired from the United States Navy, and my retirement date is January 1982. I retired in the grade of Navy Captain 06. I am married and have 3 children. I am a former prisoner of war of the Vietnam War, where I was held in captivity in North Vietnam for 70 months. I have been actively involved in the POW MIA issue since approximately 1979 through the present date. I have served on the board of directors of the National League of Families from 1983 to 1984. Additionally, I was the vice president of the NAMPOW Allied POW Wing and would have been seated to the presidency of this organization, but felt that I could not get as actively involved with this issue as I could otherwise. When I was on the board of directors for the National League of Families, I first began a professional relationship with Richard Childress, who I believe was the spokesman for the National Security Council on the issue of POWs and MIAs. As a result of my position with the National League of Families and Mr. Childress' position with the National Security Council, we developed a professional working relationship. I specifically recall sometime during the early summer of 1985, during the evening hours, receiving a telephone call from Mr. Childress at my home. The subject of the telephone conversation was directly related to the POW MIA issue. During the course of this phone conversation, which lasted approximately 1 hour, Mr. Childress and I discussed the POW MIA problem. I specifically asked Mr. Childress if he thought we had Americans still being held in captivity in Southeast Asia. He responded by saying, and I'm quoting, "You're damn right I do." I recall also discussing what was being done about the problem. Mr. Childress told me that he specifically briefed the President on the POW MIA issue. I remember also Mr. Childress saying to me that he didn't know why he was telling me this. He didn't know why he had called. I asked Mr. Childress when he would expect to get some of the POWs back, and he said in 2 or 3 years. I told him that in my opinion that was too long, that we were running out of time. And that's the end of the quote, signed Eugene B. McDaniel, 11 December 1985. In conclusion, it would be my personal hope, and most certainly the desire of the American Defense Institute and Red McDaniel, that upon completion of these hearings, the Veterans Affairs Committee will feel there are too many unanswered questions regarding the overwhelming possibility of POWs still being held against their will in Southeast Asia. And because of this, it must be incumbent upon this committee to recommend to President Reagan the formation of a presidential commission headed by H. Ross Perot to thoroughly investigate and exhaust all possible leads that have come before the Defense Intelligence Agency or any other sources, so that once and for all this most important issue can be laid to rest. For the sake of those still being held in bondage, for their families who have waited far too long, and for those young Americans contemplating military service, we implore you to take such honorable action. For Red McDaniel, the American Defense Institute, myself, and our POWs, I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Ms. Carlson. Perhaps you've done so, but for the record, Mr. McDaniel is not here, obviously. And
He has been out of the country.
he's out of the country. Where is he?
To the best of my knowledge, he's in Israel, but I have not been made privy to his entire...
And you don't know why he's over in Israel, other than he's retired and he's over in Israel?
Well, he's not retired over in Israel. He's working over in Israel.
Okay. In view of the fact that you have read basically the testimony of Captain McDaniel, I really don't feel appropriate that I have questions for you, other than with regard to the reference to Mr. Childers' comment, I guess, that occurred in the summer of 1985, where he responded, "You're damn right I do." Do you know if Mr. McDaniel had an opportunity to dialogue that a little more, in the sense of that's a substantial statement, and it would imply, well, what do we do, or where do we go from there? Do you know? Could you enlighten us a little further as to what they may have indicated would take place to try and bring the living American situation further along, or?
I wasn't present, of course, at the phone conversation, and I would say that Red McDaniel's testimony would be complete and accurate in itself, but any further questions regarding that conversation I would feel would be more appropriately addressed to Mr. McDaniel.
Mm-hmm. Because unless we can delve into that a little more, it's pretty hard to
well, I know
figure
that
out how we're going to proceed with. Okay, give us some evidence, or something that we can pass on for follow-up.
I know that Mr. McDaniel would be happy to answer any questions that the committee might have, and the only witness that I am aware was present during the conversation was, of course, his wife, being he was at home.
You don't have any idea when Mr. McDaniel will be returning to the United States?
It's my understanding that he'll be returning sometime today and may be back in the city at this time.
Today?
Today, that's correct. But he didn't know what his time frame would be.
Could you make an inquiry and advise our counsel as to his availability yet this afternoon, or
sure
perhaps Monday?
I'm sure that he would be happy if he is in. He was hoping to be in his office sometime today, but because he didn't know when, and because there was the possibility that his testimony would be needed at the beginning of the hearings, that is why he asked me to speak in his behalf.
Well, I would request that the staff initiate a communication to see what his availability might be, either in closed session this afternoon.
I'm sure he would be more than happy to appear and answer any questions you might present.
Okay, well, if
before.
you can advise the staff upon conclusion of your testimony whether or not he can appear this afternoon, that would be, we'd like him to do so. If not, Monday.
I'd be happy
All
to
right.
do that.
I very much appreciate your testimony, Ms. Carlson. Our last witness
Thank you.
Of the day before we break for 1/2 hour, and I might just announce for the benefit of those who have been with us and want to know what's going to happen next. Upon the conclusion of the last witness for the morning, Dr. Larry Ward, Demetrius Food for the Hungry International, we will break for 1/2 hour, and we will reconvene. And at my request, we are going into the chambers of the Select Committee on Intelligence, which is a secure surrounding where we can satisfy ourselves that classified information can be appropriately monitored from the standpoint of the Security Association. The witnesses will be individual witnesses. No witness will be present when another is testifying. And that room is 211 of the Hart Building. That's the second floor of the Hart Building. There are a number of security officers outside that door. Unfortunately, the waiting accommodations aren't quite what we'd like them to be, so we do apologize for whatever inconvenience that might cause. And again, we will go into session with the administration Monday in room 418 of the Russell Building. That's the fourth floor, and that's the chambers of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. The witnesses that we understand now will be testifying include Gerry Mooney, Major Smith, Sergeant McIntyre, Lieutenant Colonel Howard. I'm not aware that there may be others that we have overlooked, but if so, it would be appreciated if you would get their names up to us. You may come around the back hall, or our staff people will be available. May I ask if there's a show of hands of anyone other than the four I mentioned that we can expect? All right, thank you. Our last witness, I would call Dr. Ward. And I would ask you, sir, as you approach the witness stand, do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please signify by stating I do.
I do.
Good morning, Doctor. We look forward to your testimony.
Mr. Chairman, I'm here today because of a deep concern for Americans MIA and possibly POW in Southeast Asia, a very specific personal concern that has taken me back to Vietnam some 26 or 27 times in the past 6.5 years since August 1979. And I'm sure that all of us here, however divergent our views, share a common bottom line motivation, hearts which cry out for the fullest possible accounting and for the return of all the living. But there are differences in approach, in attitude, and so I'll speak frankly against the background of those many recent trips to Vietnam. Number one, the changed attitude in Hanoi. The Vietnamese government has taken the unprecedented, totally uncharacteristic step of building a fence around itself with its commitment to resolve this issue within the next 2 years. Well, however I may feel about that kind of government, I personally accept this as their intention in fact, because A, obviously they now see it is in their own practical self-interest to do this, and B, because of the totally changed attitude I have seen out there in Hanoi in recent months at very high levels. That change of attitude was especially visible in Hanoi exactly 1 year ago today, and I saw measurable and very positive improvement when I returned last May and again in August. Number two, our government's position. As one who has dealt with Vietnamese officialdom at all levels for over 20 years, I am convinced that what our government is doing now, key word now, is exactly the right approach. I base this not only on what little I myself may know about the Vietnamese mindset, but on the words of Vietnamese officials who have commented to me very freely and frankly on our President's representatives as tough negotiators, and this from Hanoi is a compliment. I am convinced that this program of front door approach, of quiet diplomacy, of effective and uncompromising negotiation is in fact working, and soon we all will know. Three, the proposal for a special commission. The years have crawled by. I can understand the frustration, the impatience, which cries out for something, anything, to expedite the process. Perhaps a few years ago, when this issue was not assigned that highest level national priority, which, thank God, it has today, perhaps back then such a commission might have been a good idea. But with the process clearly working, with that intention, the 2-year commitment on the international public record, now is not the time for change. Please understand, it's my view that Hanoi regards the present negotiations as the President's own process. I'm sure that's a factor in the 24-month commitment. When they feel they are dealing with the President himself, they will never understand the rationale for a separate commission. If I know anything at all about the Vietnamese thought processes, I can assure you that the establishment of such a commission now would send a very confusing signal to Hanoi, could interrupt the steady forward progress and very likely derail the present rescue train of quiet diplomacy. Please remember my own efforts have been under the umbrella of a private voluntary agency. In the early 1980s, we proposed in Hanoi a joint search committee, joint excavation efforts. But when I sensed a year ago that the SRVN was ready to move into direct government-to-government cooperation along these very lines, my colleagues and I were more than willing to set aside the private approach. The issue is too important, I want to say too sacred, for anyone not to be willing to do the same. I would also point to the fundamental illogic of protesting here in Washington when the answers lie out there in Hanoi. Number four, any call for direct military action. I've lived with this issue since May 30, 1962. If it were as simple as crawling through the jungles or attempting some kind of rescue by air or sea, believe me, I'd want to be the first to volunteer. God knows I would leave tonight, but it's not that simple. The more convinced we are that there are live Americans in Indochina, the more we feel that there is more than one location in which this might be true, the more this itself points up the folly of any military approach, official or private. Too many years have dragged by. Let those who believe most strongly in the possibility of live Americans be first to acknowledge the inherent danger to the many by trying to rescue the few. A personal confession. I've felt that frustration. In the past, it's led me to listen to any source, anywhere in the world, which claimed to have specific MIA information, however flaky or shaky that source might be. I've been all down the road of pictures and dog tags and packets of bones and bizarre proposals for over 11 years. Well, now, as I near the end of what I say, three things stand out. A, the sources are almost invariably the same, recycling the same tired old claims. B, the alleged locations always seem to be in areas readily available to the resistance, illogical though this would be from the standpoint of anyone holding prisoners. C, definite ID, well, that's always going to come just a little later. But the years have gone by without a single definite, meaningful, verifiable name from those private sources. If the closed sessions produce such information, as one who's lived with this issue for 23 and a half years, I want to be the first to rejoice. But soon we will know whether that's true or whether we are pointed once again down that same old dusty road of tired claims. I remind all of us that the burden of proof rests on those who make such claims, and I feel very strongly that the biggest danger of cover-up can come from the private sector if we withhold information which could be correlated and synthesized with all appropriate intelligence. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I appeal to all of us through this hearing for unity. May I quickly read my last two paragraphs? What a terrible responsibility for anyone who refuses to give our President and his process, after all these years, this 24-month chance. I feel that responsibility not only extends to those who might spread wild and unconfirmed stories, make serious charges, or propose bizarre solutions, but even to the well-intentioned, if naive, proposal for that special commission which I so strongly feel could seriously derail the present steady forward progress. The cause is too sacred, the issue is too real. For the sake of Archie Mitchell and Floyd Olson and Harley Hall and Earl Hopper Jr., whose name I wear on this band, for 2,437 other names that I wish we could all read aloud in this room, I feel we must support our President and his process, give it that 24-month chance to prove itself, and send now a united signal to Hanoi. This is a new day of hope.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ward. I very much appreciate your contribution to the record. You indicated you've been to Vietnam 26 or 27 times, beginning when?
August of 1979, 6.5 years ago, on top of 77 previous visits beginning back in August of 1958.
77 previous
until
visits.
April 27, 1975.
Were all these in a humanitarian?
Yes, we've been involved in Vietnam continuously in relief and development, social welfare assistance.
When was your
programs.
last trip to Vietnam?
I was there last in August, early September.
What has been your accessibility in the countryside, outside of Hanoi, outside of Ho Chi Minh City? And so
I've driven from Da Nang to Hue to Vinh to Haiphong to the Chinese border. I've been in Sante, a place many of us will remember. I've been in Nam Dinh, which Senator Denton will remember all too well. Traveled many areas of the South.
Do you feel you've had unrestricted access to Vietnam?
In South Vietnam, I've had dozens and dozens of totally free conversations, many with dear friends from years gone by.
When I say access, I mean physical presence to travel throughout South Vietnam and North Vietnam. Can you distinguish what my question specifically is? Do you feel you've had unlimited access? Could you go where you wanted to go?
Not totally unlimited. I would wish that I could live there and go everywhere, but we've never been refused on any area that we've asked to visit.
Then how do you know that there's areas that you couldn't have gone to?
Oh, there may very well be. That could be. We'd find out if we asked.
But you've asked, have you ever asked to go to an area that you were particularly motivated by allegations that there may be Americans living in those areas?
No, for the past 6 years, our approach has also been on a private basis, the direct front door approach of diplomacy. I'm convinced it may not be spectacular, it may not be flamboyant, but the answers to every question that have been raised in this room lie out there in Indochina. And I'm convinced that Vietnam, whatever its motivations, but with its practical self-interest, it's as much in their interest as ours to resolve this issue.
Well, I agree, but you've, of all the witnesses, you have had the extraordinary experience of probably traveling more, and you've indicated that you had accessibility to wherever you've requested to go. And my question is a bit narrow, but it's reflected on, since you are in the humanitarian business of making that kind of a contribution, have you had occasion to ask to go to a place because the motivation was basically information relative to hopefully that there may be living Americans being held in those areas?
Not specifically, because I don't think any of us at this point can pinpoint such an area.
My question is, though, since there is so much information on the allegations, and you've acknowledged that you have listened to it, observed it, participated, my question is, why wouldn't you take what you believe to be the most significant and worthy evidence and make an inquiry to go to that area just to satisfy your intent as a humanitarian?
I appreciated the opportunity to travel throughout the country, and if I knew of such an area today I specifically wanted to visit, as has been said to you, I'd like to go back to Foreign Minister Todd, with whom I've talked many times on this issue, say, sir, I'd like to go here, whoever the responsible authority is. We've not seen that need. We have seen the process.
What is your particular position on the issue of alleged Americans being held against their will in Vietnam or Laos?
That strong possibility has motivated me for 23 and a half years. It took me back to Vietnam in June of 1973. And while we've had significant self-help projects in Vietnam, that's been the thing that's kept me going there more than anything
So your
else.
position specifically is, sir?
That there very likely are live Americans being held against their will somewhere in Indochina. And certainly, there are live ones there, probably a large number of defectors.
Do you have any comments? It's my understanding, and I don't know this for a fact, but I intend to ask the administration, but I would ask you. I was told by the French ambassador at our breakfast in Hanoi that there was a Frenchman that came out of Vietnam a year ago after living some 39 years there. He had been a defector from the French military forces. France had granted amnesty. Our nation does not grant amnesty, so anyone anticipating coming back to the United States would face the appropriate military action. Are you knowledgeable in that area?
Related to the Frenchman, not specifically.
No, on whether, if there were a person who defected, would he face action from the military authorities upon return?
I don't know, but I would hope at this late day in history, for what it could mean to the whole cause, we might be willing to consider such a general amnesty. In the case of the defector, not the treasonous deserter.
Would it be something that your organization might recommend to the Congress?
I'd be very happy to make such a recommendation.
Well, I'm just asking for your consideration
Yes,
because
surely.
my question is an obvious one.
Sure.
If we did have amnesty, and I'm still not totally sure I know what I'm talking about because I don't know, but I'm led to believe that we have not granted amnesty. My question is, if we did, would it perhaps encourage any that may have defected to come back and at least resolve to their loved ones their whereabouts?
I'm sure it would. I think when I first started going in, sir, I was not aware of the significance of the defector. I was there concerned about the person held against his will. I think I've looked into the face of a defector. I wish I'd pursued it more.
I have a little discomfort in my line of questioning where you've acknowledged that your motivation, of course, has been living Americans, but yet your access to the countryside has not necessarily zeroed in on information that you may have had that would have led you to want to go to one of those places or another.
My concerns extend to the whole country. We've been able to travel just about everywhere we could go. May I speak to one side, sir? I don't want to prolong this, but the other side of the coin of what you just spoke. In June of 1982, I laid on Foreign Minister Todd a proposed memorandum of agreement between Food for the Hungry International, of which I was then the president, and the SRVN that called for a joint committee. One section in that provided that whether or not we wanted to accept it, we acknowledged the position of the SRVN that they were not holding live Americans, but also by signature on that document, they would acknowledge our concern for Americans still hiding in the jungles, as in the case of the Japanese in the Philippines so many years, being held for exploitation by dissident groups, which would be an interesting catch-all and opportunity for Vietnam to cooperate whenever it wanted to, or thirdly, being hidden by individual Vietnamese families. We suggested there that they would extend, by signature on that document, a general amnesty from their view to any Americans that might be hiding in their country.
That's a question I want to ask the administration. You alluded to your observation of the cooperation of late between the Vietnamese government and the issue of both remains and their willingness to follow up on live sighting information. And you said that over the years you've observed this change. What, sir, is, in your opinion, the motivation for this change?
I think they feel they are dealing with the president. I think they feel they have a limited time frame in which to bring around the resolution of this humanitarian issue. And I think obviously in the back of their minds, while they themselves now carefully separate it as a humanitarian issue, which originally they did not do, I'm sure they look at it in the context of the long-range normalization, economic aid they so desperately need, and all the rest.
Have you traveled throughout Laos?
I've been in Laos. I've not traveled
How
throughout
many times
Laos.
have you been in Laos?
I think just twice since the change of 75.
You indicated you oppose the establishment of the special commission because you think it would send mixed signals. Could you be more specific? Mixed signals are mixed signals, but the benefits of the effort are something of that.
I think the
would be
Vietnamese
determining
understand government, chain of command, delegated authority, the straight processes of government. But whether another commission coming in, when they feel they have been dealing, as has been indicated to me, with the very top, because the president's representative has been president there, this is that signal that I think might discourage them. They might think it's a reaction to even the many different voices we have heard here.
You indicated in your written testimony that you read an ABC, which was a kind of a summary. You're willing to listen, but many months went by, the dust began to settle, and 2 or 3 simple facts stood out. One, the sources were almost invariably the same, apparently, quote, working a good thing, unquote. How can you possibly make that generalization unless you have access to classified information?
I'm talking about private claims, private sources. I'm talking about the Hmong, the Yao, the Lao resistance, the KPNLF, and so on. People who have been in contact, private sources in contact with these groups.
So this is your own personal opinion, then, obviously, of the situation as opposed to having the accessibility of any classified information relative to your conclusion that that the information is invariably the same, which is what you said.
Talking about the things that concern private individuals here that bounce off the walls, they always seem to take us back to the same sources.
Representative McKeon, do you have any questions? I'd like, just a minute, I'm not quite through, but almost. What is your assessment, and I think you've touched on it, but of non-government U.S. citizens playing a role in the resolution of the issue of MIAs?
I mean, and I might refer to myself and our efforts?
Well, no. Obviously, you're in the humanitarian business, and I assume that you've gained the respect of the foreign minister, or he wouldn't receive you in the manner in which he has. And I'm more interested in your assessment of efforts of a semi-clandestine nature that are being talked about, and I think the media has picked up on, and in reality there are probably less of them that are really active than we are led to believe. What is your assessment of that effort? It's a well-meaning effort, obviously.
I think it's all well-meaning, but I'm concerned about anything that would detract from the present, steady, forward progress. It's only going to take us those 24 months, perhaps 18 months now, then we'll know.
You've observed, obviously, the government of Vietnam for some time, and we heard the testimony from Senator Denton with regard to his assessment of their motivation and I guess you might say an evolution of philosophical changes, but I think that the terminology was used that they have misled, they have lied, they have done various other things. Why, outside of the evidence that they appear to be more cooperative, can we summarize that they're not attempting ultimately to mislead us again?
I think they have as much at stake in this as we do.
And that,
they have
at that stake, sir, is specifically again?
They have built a fence around themselves. They have said within 2 years we will resolve this issue. They are on record before the whole world that they're going to do this. Why not?
How do you account for our experience where they've emphatically denied the existence of living Americans being held against their will, both in Laos and Hanoi? And we said, all right, we've heard this time and time again. We've gone through the litany of foreign minister talk indicating his willingness to take us around. But still, when we make what appears to be a very legitimate appeal for a Red Cross group or a humanitarian group from the UN to go in so we can see for ourselves, why do you think they refuse this? They say, well, our sovereignty. You question our word. We're telling you there's no one there. But, you know, that obviously draws the conclusion of suspicion. And I think our members were unanimous in that observation, those of us who went there, that, gee, you know, you're telling us all this, but you've misled us before, and we're asking if you would please allow an independent group to come in.
Why would the Vietnamese hold prisoners except to have a bargaining card that they want to play when they want to play it in direct government-to-government relationship?
Well, I know, but that would conflict with your previous statement where you suggested that, good heavens, you know, they're in front of the world now, and the world is watching and going to take them to task if they don't tell the truth, and then you conclude that, well, they're waiting for the right moment to release these people. I don't see that the two points are harmonious.
When I say they are on record in terms of the total time frame, when 24 months has elapsed and that hasn't happened, then let's look at whatever at that point needs to be done. This was their time frame. This is the fence that they have built.
I know, but that time frame was specific with regard to remains.
I've understood it to be, and this has certainly informally and unofficially been said to me, it is the resolution of the issue. And I think they're aware that all of us that have talked with them have realized it in the back of everyone's thinking. In the Chinese checkers you play, the big issue is the live issue.
My colleague?
After having denied for so long that there are living Americans under their control, Is it logical at all that they would ever release them in 24 months or 24 years?
No problem whatever, sir, when it's to their advantage to do it. There's a definition of truth that serves my purposes. And as I said, perhaps you were out of the room, but we had listed to them a number of face-saving options, and I think they could multiply that with no difficulty.
They can say we've been lying all along, but here they are.
We have discovered them.
We've discovered them.
Sure. And no difficulty. Let me say this, that the Vietnamese I have talked to by the dozens in South Vietnam and by the hundreds of the overseas Vietnamese, where we look at it with North American mentality and say, why on earth would they hold anyone all these years? This has never been a problem to my Vietnamese friends, not once to my recollection. They say, you don't understand this. This is the way we work. Our clock moves at a different pace from yours. Please know I hold no brief, sir, for Vietnam. I'd like to clarify that in case I give the wrong impression. We operated a rescue ship for 2.5 years, picking up their victims. My hands were stained with dying blood, both Vietnamese and American, out there too many times. But I also have said that this comes a time when at last some of us who have said it is in your own practical self-interest to cooperate feel at last we got through.
Well, I understand what you're saying. I personally would view an action with unforgiveness if indeed the Vietnamese on one hand say they have nobody, and then for their own self-serving purposes, when we're dealing with what amounts to the very basic humanitarian principle, and should suddenly see fit for their own means to suddenly find, and I just, that's my own particular conclusion, find a tremendous conflict there.
I suppose we could declare war, or we could say we've all been talking about live prisoners. What then do we do when in fact some are found?
Well, I guess that's the doubt that we'll have until it's resolved, and the purpose of the hearing and the bottom line and the reflection and the reason there's still hope. And, I commend you for that, and maybe we can have some more enlightenment on that in the classified portion that we'll be going into. It would seem that there is some exposure to the Asian tradition and custom of face in the view that certainly we heard, and it was very emphatic that they were not holding anyone against their will. And, I beg your pardon, under their control.
Under their control.
Under their control. Now, obviously, the implication that there could be living Americans of their own choosing is something that's certainly very real in addition. But, boy, I tell you, it's my opinion that the American people would really explode to the issue that they tell us this on one hand, and then on the next hand, they suddenly find people that have been held against their will. But again, that's subjective and not appropriate for me to expound on as chairman of this. But I think your point and your observation on this is significant in the record, and it's something we intend to go into in the classified briefing.
Mr. Senator, may I just say, after years of dealing with the Vietnamese, I don't think I'm altogether naive at this point. But I'm ready to assign that 24-month chance to see. There may be a tunnel at the end of the light when we get there that calls for more action. But I'm anxious to see what happens in the next 24 months.
Mr. McKeon, do you have any further statements before I conclude this portion of the hearing?
Thank you.
I want to thank you, Dr. Ward. I think that we have compiled a very valuable and worthwhile record in the 2 days of open hearings. I would invite those witnesses who've testified and other members who've been kind enough to sit through the hearing to rejoin us Monday in room 418 at 10 o'clock. We will recess now and reconvene at 1:30 in a closed session. The witnesses, again, that will be with us at that time are on a piece of paper somewhere. I'm sure they know who they are. McIntyre, Smith, Mooney, and Howard, and they may present themselves to the staff at the Hart Building, second floor, at 1:30, and we'll have them seated individually. Again, I thank all of you for being with us, and I wish you a very good day, and thank you, Dr. Ward.
Howard needs to be first because he's catching a plane back to Germany.
I've got to go catch.
And they each have a plane.
Do the top secret stuff, segregated from the code, so that someone who has top secret clearance could review the top secret transfer.
Okay. There's a box.
I'll talk to you. I think it's only Mooney. Mooney, I think, is the only.
I'd be happy to do
Is
it.
it Mooney the only? And you're going to be there.
I'm just sorry that I'm going to ask members of the whether we can put in spots.
You know, we do the best we can. I'm glad that we had the quality witnesses that we have. I think
It'll work that way.